A theme I think about a lot is part dependence. We make a decision, or something happens to us, or we meet somebody, and it doesn't seem like a big deal at the time, but it changes and shapes the course of our lives. This is especially so when it comes to people. We can bump into someone who helps us become the best version of ourselves, who inspires us to learn and grow, and once that motion begins, we continue with good habits. We gather around fellow travelers, and our life will change for the better. Equally, if we hang around with toxic people, it could turn into a vicious cycle instead of a virtuous one. Today's episode is a happy one, though, in which one of my favorite thinkers and human beings looks back on the people who shaped him. We speak about friendship, mentorship, the serendipity that can nurture a life and a soul. Because even for those who live in the world of ideas, eventually it all comes down to people. People shape you, people sustain you, people are all you have.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is a historian, Ram Guha, on the seen and the unseen for the 7th time. When we first started chatting on the show many years ago, we spoke about books and ideas and historical figures. We began with a two-parter about Gandhi. Then we did an episode discussing the past and future of this republic in suitably solemn tones. But as time went by and the show changed, so did the nature of our conversations. Ram was kind enough and generous enough and trusting enough to always speak from the heart, and we got many glimpses of who he was as a human being, the dreams he had at night, the music that moved him, the mistakes he made. This particular conversation took place in December when I had parked myself in Bangalore to record a bunch of episodes, and we decided to speak about a few people who meant a lot to him, some of whom the world may not have heard of. He sent me 13 suggestions, and I, being a greedy podcaster, wanted to chat about all of them. But time was a constraint, and Ram eventually cut the list down to less than half of that number. Now, I love this conversation because this was Ram looking back on life and friendships and how he will change by these people, and it also served as a lesson to me to pay more attention to the people in my life, to cherish those who I should cherish, to not see what is truly beautiful about the world only in hindsight. What I have to learn from Ram go far beyond the lessons of history. I think you might agree with that sentiment, but before we get into this conversation, let's take a quick commercial break. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've enjoyed teaching 27 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing, and an online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, and a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs rupees 10,000 plus GST, or about $150. If you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just a willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Ram, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you, Amit.
We seem to be making an annual tradition of this almost, but our last episode was possibly 18-19 months ago, early last year. How have you been since then?
How have I been? The usual kind of stuff, except that I've not been traveling much. My mother was in her advanced 90s and not well. And in fact, she passed away a couple of weeks ago peacefully at home, and which was a blessing because she never wanted to go to the hospital. But because she was with us, Sujata, my wife, and I had to coordinate our travels. So the real difference is that over the last 2 years, I've been largely in Bangalore, which is fine because if you don't have to commute, Bangalore remains the most livable big city in India, with that caveat, if you don't have to commute.
And what is your work rate like? Like when I think of sort of your prodigious output so far over the years, you seem to be coming up with books and essays and articles all of the time. How do you sort of look at that aspect of it? In one of the many essays that you send me on Andre Betel, you talk about how in 1988 he's berating you because you're always doing this, doing that, and so productive, so whatever. And it's almost like he's telling you to slow down and take it easy.
So I have slowed down. I have obeyed Andre. I work probably 3-4 hours a day not 8 or 9. I listen to a lot more music. We've discussed my love for classical music in the past, but now I listen to much more. I go for long walks in Kaban Park, which I've had to temporarily stop because I have a back problem which may need an operation, which is kind of usual aging stuff. But I read. I have started reading more fiction than I did before, and I'm actually easing off. So I don't work at a crazy frenetic pace. I still read, I still write, I still think of book projects, I still work with younger scholars on their books, but I do many other things too.
Tell me about how your reading has changed. Like you said, you're reading more fiction. Are you attracted to different kinds of books?
I've been reading classics, so, Tolstoy and George Eliot, and some very fine 20th century writers whom my son Keshava has been recommending. So Penelope Fitzgerald, Barbara Pym, Shirley Hazard, interestingly all women. Yeah, and of course the usual biography, autobiography, some history, a little bit of cricket. I just read, after many years, I read 2 wonderful cricket books, both by the same writer, Vic Marks, the former England off spinner. And he wrote a memoir of county cricket. And of course now county cricket is also, like in India, Ranji Trophy is given over to the IPL, there it's the hundreds and so on. So I like that very much. And that was followed by a kind of thematic book he wrote on different aspects, technical and aesthetic aspects of cricket, called Late Cuts. So, but one last thing I had to say about Andre, which is not there in the essay I sent you, because the essay was quite some time ago. Or maybe it's called, I can't remember whether it's in that essay. When I had an accident, he said, now at least you'll have more time to think and you won't bullshit. So I think that balance between speaking and writing, obviously, if you're a writer, you need to take your work out in the world, you need to give public talks, you need to give interviews. But writing requires solitude and reflection. And I think that balance has always been hard for people like me, who are generally gregarious, to find. But I think now I'm probably in a better place.
That anecdote is in the essay. In fact, I think the exact quote is that he said it's a blessing in disguise that you had an accident.
Yeah.
You mentioned Penelope Fitzgerald. She's one of my favorite novelists. And one thing that I always find deeply inspiring about her is that she started writing novels very late in life.
Yes.
Her first novel was like when she was in her 60s. I think my favorite book of hers, Gate of Angels, was, I think, when she was past 70. And I've had occasion to think about not just late starters, but the kind of work people do late in their lives, where I visited Spain earlier this year and I made it like an art education holiday for myself. And one thing that I noticed, and I even did an episode of my YouTube show on it, one thing that I noticed is that all of the 5 great Spanish artists, Velázquez, Goya, Picasso, Dali, and Miro, while they were very successful when they were young and very celebrated when they were young, my favorite work of theirs, which really spoke to me with the greatest power, was work that was done when they were in their 70s and 80s. And some of that work is so incredibly powerful, and they no longer have anything to prove. They're not trying to be virtuoso figures. It almost seems like they have taken many steps back, zoomed out from the world, and can connect dots and, paint pictures that no one else can see. Extremely powerful work by all of them. And I wonder what you think about that, both in terms of how your thinking about the world has changed as you have grown older, and also what you have seen in others, that we often imagine with the arrogance of youth that when a person gets to a certain age, they are past it. But actually, so many people do their most powerful work when they are much older. Like even in your great essay about C.L.R. James, Beyond a Boundary comes out when he's in his early 60s.
That's right.
And it almost feels like the kind of book which a young man could not have written. He had to have the weight of the decades
Absolutely.
behind him.
So that book, that's a very good example of a late work which could only have been written then, because it's he's in his mid 60s. Here is a man born, I think, in 1899 or so, at the turn of the century, early 1900s, grows up in West Indies, cricket mad. But is interested in many other things, becomes a Trotskyist revolutionary, spends 15 years in America, is detained in Ellis Island, gets involved in the Pan-Africanist movement, and then returns to England then goes to the West Indies. After many years, returns to his homeland, is involved in politics, editing a newspaper also, but incidentally, through politics, leads the campaign to have the first black captain elected. Black cricketer elected captain of the West Indies team was Frank Worrell, and then goes back to England, and that's where he then writes his extraordinary book. So some kind of books can only be written at a certain stage of your life. If I was to give my example, India After Gandhi, which is probably my best known book, could only have been written in my 40s because I had the necessary maturity and experience and I still had energy. I could not have written that today. So that may be true, but it varies a lot among professions. I cannot say I don't follow art very much, but musicians generally do their best work early. Both composers, I mean, the great German composers, Beethoven, Mozart, I think much of their work. A singer I have particularly admired all my life and still listen a lot to is Bob Dylan. And nothing he has done since the mid 70s has remotely equaled the work of the 60s and early 70s.
I must absolutely protest and say Time Out of Mind, which I think was 95 or 96,
Okay.
with songs like, Make You Feel My Love and Not Dark Yet is his masterpiece in my view.
Okay, but
yeah.
so I think, and then of course there are philosophers, and I would make a stronger case for philosophers than mathematicians. But I think novelists, historians, essayists, even not analytical philosophers, but you should say moral and social philosophers. The more they see of the world, I mean, I'm sure, they distill more and so on. Yeah, so I think it varies a lot among professions. I think certainly with music, largely classical music. Classical music, I'll give you an example. I mean, because Dylan is different, because Dylan, of course, was a singer and he was also a poet. And even if his voice fell apart, the words could compel and move you. And he had quite massive orchestration to back him up, or arguably to hide his weaknesses in his later years. But if you're an instrumentalist, if you look at, say, Ali Akbar, Ravi Shankar, their best, really, they were wonderful all through their 20s and 30s and 40s. And then they started declining. A possible exception even there could be Bismillah, who was playing at the top of his form right till the end. So, yeah, it varies a lot. I can say clearly that, as far as I'm concerned, my best work is behind me. I have no illusions about that. I'll still be writing books and they'll have some interesting new things to say. They might explore a new vein of archival materials. But in terms of just analytical sharpness and opening up a field, I think I'm now just kind of, I wouldn't say passing the time, but doing the best I can, which is not the best I could do 10 or 15 years ago.
There's this lovely book I'm reading called From Strength to Strength by Arthur Brooks, where the subtitle of the book is How to Make the Most of the Second Part of Your Life. And the point he makes in the first chapter, which makes you wonder why he wrote the book, but then he gives it another spin in the second chapter. But the point he makes in his first chapter is that decline is inevitable, and he'll say, okay, mathematicians and musicians decline much earlier than others. Historians, according to him, decline the last, but by the early 50s...
He's probably right.
By the early,
I mean, like Hobsbawm was writing into his 90s.
Yeah, so but to finish the point I'm making, so he points out different rates of decline, but he says that decline, you can only call it a decline if you measure one kind of intelligence, which is fluid intelligence, which is the ability to pick up something really fast, to master it, the energy. And then he says there's another kind of intelligence called crystallized intelligence, which begins in the middle years and it can either go on forever or it can plateau, but it never actually declines. And his point, therefore, was that the best CEOs, the best teachers, the older you get, you find more of them, because what crystallized intelligence helps you do is it helps you zoom out, it helps you see the bigger picture. Even with instrumentalists, what you mentioned, the virtuoso things that you could do when you were 25 as a guitarist or pianist or whatever, you can't do at 55. But the tehrav that you might possess, or the way that you, see the landscape of music, is something that you could not have done when you were young. Like in his book, he gives the example of Johann Sebastian Bach, whose, most celebrated works were actually done towards the end of his life, where he was no longer celebrated in his own time. His son was considered much greater than him. So he was doing these instructional kind of books on how to write fugues and whatever. I've forgotten the exact details. But today we look back on some of that stuff which he was using as teaching aids as, some of the greatest works of music of that period. So, in terms of fluid intelligence and crystallized, perhaps you are right when you talk about the energy and the speed that something like India after Gandhi may have required. But I remember when we recorded our episodes on Gandhi, you pointed me to a beautiful book of essays by Rajmohan Gandhi called The Good Boatman.
Yes.
And now when I think of it off the cuff, it strikes me that Mr. Gandhi must have written that when he was of sufficiently advanced years.
He was in his 60s.
Yeah, because the kind of perspectives
Mid-60s.
that you
Mid-60s.
have. Because the kind of
I think
perspectives.
late 90s. I think it's 97 or 98. So in the mid-60s.
Mid-60s. Because the kind of perspectives that has, you can't really have them in your 30s.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting distinction between fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And I haven't heard it before, but it does make sense for sure.
Let's sort of, before we get to, the theme of this episode, which is lesser known people whom you admire, which my listeners may not have heard of, and a couple of them I hadn't heard of. Before we get to them, I also want to ask you about the shaping of the self and the role of others in this. Like a lot of this we possibly realize only through hindsight. Like when I look back, when I think of, how was I shaped? How did I become who I became? And a lot of it is very diffused and you can't attribute credit to it to particular people, but a lot of it is the influence of people, either good or bad. When did you start thinking about this? I mean, this is stuff that you only see in hindsight, right? Like, how do you think about the shaping of your own self when you look back, and how much of it is circumstance that, oh, you happen to, meet Krishna Raj at a particular point, or you happen to be mentored by Dharma Kumar and have her as a friend at a particular point, and, these people shaped you in different ways, but at the same time, your meeting them is kind of circumstantial. You may never have met them or been with them.
A lot of it is circumstantial. In my case, I think I've been coincidences played a very, very large part in my life. The way I've been directed to people, and maybe talk about some of that, and accidentally met them, and then they've gone on to become profound and enduring influences on the way I think and work, and so on. I'd say, but of course, early on, there would be influences. So I'd say family, particularly, in my case, my parents and one or two of my uncles and aunts. And I think who had a certain, it's hard to express it without sounding pompous or self-regarding, but I'll say nonetheless, who had a certain moral decency and, uprightness that I think always influenced me. I mean, they didn't really shape me as an intellectual or as a writer, but just like they were, people of enormous integrity and dignity, and never really discriminated according to religion and caste and gender and so on. And in a unself-conscious way, they were not theorists of how to be a good citizen, but they were practicing it. But otherwise, a lot of it. But I think it's very. I think openness to influences is, I think, very important. And in Indian, I was often in not just in Indian universities, but in many universities, when you're doing kind of research or you're a young researcher, there's a tendency to become part of a group and a cult around a charismatic figure. Now, I was lucky to escape that. You go to, if you look at Cambridge in the 30s and 40s, and you're all around Keynes. So if you were studying, philosophy in Harvard, it could be Quine or Rawls. And I think I was lucky to escape that, because that often then that kind of identification with one mentor and membership of a cult, I think, is a great impediment to your own intelligence, creativity, and originality. And I found my own way and found many different people who influenced me, And I think that's what I would often tell people, that don't really. I mean, it's you could admire someone, but don't consider that person as to be your mentor or your guru. That I think can cripple your own ability to think for yourself.
I'll quote a passage from your essay on Dharma Kumar where you've written about her. Quote, Dharma Kumar was impatient with intellectuals who did not think for themselves, who thought in a herd or followed the party line. She abhorred the drawing of rigid boundaries according to ideology. She believed that individuals should be able to disagree on specific issues while coming together on other issues. But the tendency of Indian intellectuals has always been to stereotype and pigeonhole. Stop quote. And I wonder whether this sort of intellectual independence, that you're always thinking of every issue separate from, whether it is fashionable among a certain tribe or not, whether, you mentioned that you were lucky not to fall in with that, but could it equally be said that you were not the kind of person who would have fallen in for that, so you were drawn to people like Dharma Kumar? Or do you think that given the wrong circumstances, you could also have joined a
I could
herd?
easily have fallen into that. I think, given the wrong
Mm.
circumstance. But let me just make one remark about the paragraph you quoted. So, about the herd mentality and tendency to stereotype and pigeonhole. Now, I'm talking about 30 years ago, and I'm referring to pigeonholing and stereotyping by the left. Now, of course, it's ubiquitous among the right in our country. So, I'm called a Marxist, though I'm very far from being a Marxist. I'm called a Congress chamcha, although not many people have savaged the Gandhi dynasty as brutally as I have. So, but it's interesting that the kind of pigeonholing, stereotyping, crude categorization, black and white thinking, which we now see so visibly among the right in India, was once typified by the left. I mean, we kind of forget that, and Dharma Kumar was the victim of left-wing stereotyping, who couldn't appreciate or understand her nuanced, principle, subtle liberalism, and called her an apologist for multinational corporations, the World Bank, whatever else, whatever other swear words the Marxist left had in those days. So I think that. When I read that, I realized that I was talking about the Marxist left, and the same thing applies to the Hindutva right today.
The same thing applies on both left and right. And if anything, social media has made the incentives
Yes.
to stray to the extremes
Absolutely.
and stray to the party line much worse.
Absolutely.
So, I was struck by the commonality between some of these people you've named as your heroes. For example, you talk about Shivram Karant, and at one point, when you speak about the children's encyclopedia that he tried to do in the 1930s, you say that he was dismayed by the quote-unquote intellectual thinness of the Kannada country. And later, you speak about your teacher Anjan Ghosh, who taught you an IIM in 1980, and you speak about how, despite being a Marxist, he went down a deeply unorthodox route in his appreciation of caste as an organizing factor. You
Yes.
speak about, the great essay he wrote, The Seventh Indian, which basically had been ignored by sociologists and Marxists, and how he brought that angle in. And today, Marxists would accept
Yes.
that idea, but at that time,
Yes. 1979. This is.
in 1979,
45 years ago.
it's completely heretical.
Yeah, because
Right?
it's all class. For Marxists, it's all class. Yeah.
So all of these people,
Ah.
in a sense, are not just people who by circumstance were thrown into, either proximity with you, or they were intellectual influences like C.L.R. James, but that they were also iconoclasts in that sense, that they were not part of an intellectual
I
fashion
would not
or a
call them
fad.
iconoclasts. Iconoclast technically means idol breaker.
Hmm.
I mean, maverick in the good sense of the term, or independent minded. Iconoclast means that they're really interested in smashing something that they weren't. So that, I think, with that caveat, yes, independent minded, finding their own way, seekers who didn't want to be bound by a party line. Incidentally, next time you come to Bangalore, I must ask you to come home, only to show you the keepsakes on my study table. So above my study table is a poster of a concert that the great sitarist Ravi Shankar gave at Yale in 1986. The poster designed by my wife Sujata and is inscribed by Ravi Shankar. And on my desk, behind me is Gandhi and Ambedkar. Behind me is a bust of Gandhi and Ambedkar. Behind. On my desk is a bust of Shivram Karant, because he's actually the greatest Indian I've ever met in the flesh. I mean, I've written about many extraordinary people who died long before me. So I think Shivram Karant in that sense, because, and I would love a good biography of him, which has to be written by a fluent bilingual intellectual, Kannada. And he was an extraordinary figure. And, it's, as I say in my essay, that he was full, it is, and I think, are you half Bengali or full Bengali?
I'm half Bengali,
Okay.
but I consider myself Bengali.
Okay. So I think I have said that when I once wrote in a Calcutta paper that he was fully the equal of Tagore, and took care not to go back to Bengal for a few years after that. But I believe that. I mean, he was extraordinarily multifaceted. So I think, iconoclast, I would take mild objection to that term. I think independent-minded, you could say, even maverick doesn't necessarily have to have a pejorative connotation. It just means someone who's doing things that are unorthodox, unexpected, different from the mainstream.
I came across a wonderful term which may or may not fit them. I think it may fit some of them, it may not fit the others. It was coined by Janan Ganesh in a recent essay in the Financial Times, and the term is partial outsider. And the way he defines it, and I very much feel that I am one, and the way he defines it is a partial outsider is someone who doesn't belong to a particular field, so he can ignore the dogmas and the conventions. But he's not a complete outsider. He has one foot in and he can still
Right.
influence that field, and therefore partial outsider. And therefore, these people tend to be extremely effective.
That applies to many of them.
That applies to many of these people. Since you mentioned Bengalis, before we get to talking about the first of your heroes, let me inform all my Bengali listeners that there's a delightful passage I'm going to quote from Ram. You wrote this about Andre Betel, but it's more about Bengalis, where you say Andre Betel is half French, half Bengali, and wholly Indian. He loves his country in a way Bengali intellectuals rarely do. Bengalis are not at all insular, except that when they interest themselves in other people, it tends not to be other Indians. I once joked in this newspaper that all famous Bengalis have two nationalities. Thus, Niratsi Chaudhary was Bengali and English, Satyajit Ray Bengali and French, Jyoti Basu Bengali and Russian, Charu Mazumdar Bengali and Chinese. I added that Rabindranath Tagore might have been the last famous Bengali to have been both Bengali and Indian. Stop quote.
I loved writing that, and to my great delight, that the original column, and not the one on Andre where I quoted, the original column in the Telegraph, which was published 20 years ago, 25 years ago maybe, has been anthologized by Arvind Krishna Malhotra in the best of Indian essays. Because Arvind, like me, I think, all Indian writers and intellectuals of a certain generation, quite widespread. So I'm in my 60s, Arvind is in his late 70s, but of that kind of cohort, a cohort above and a cohort below of me, felt really had a profoundly ambivalent relationship towards Bengali intellectuals, because Bengali intellectuals thought they're the center of the world. And, so I think Arvind liked my takedown of the Bengalis and hence put it there. Yeah.
The origin of the universe is a Big Bang theory. So I want to start by talking about Dharma Kumar. I found it really fascinating. Even in the past, whatever I've read of her and by her and about her has fascinated me. But the first thing I want to ask you is about the nature of the friendship between you and her, because there was a 30-year difference between the two of you.
Correct.
You point out that when she wrote that inscription on the second issue of a magazine in 1983, she was 55, you were 25.
Yeah.
And I'm struck by that because one of my guests, I forget who, maybe Ranjit Hoskote, pointed out that such friendships are rare in modern times. And I've been very fortunate that I have friends who are 20, 25 years older than me, and I have friends who are 30, 35 years younger than me. And these are incredibly rewarding and incredibly important, I feel. So and you are also someone who has had friendships with some of these heroes that you've named and you're going to talk about, but at the same time, you've been a mentor to a generation of young writers and historians, many of whom I'm sure you'd call friends. So tell me about your views of having these intergeneration friendships.
So I'll talk about the latter, my friendship with younger people. And recently, there's a wonderful bilingual Kannada writer. He's a scholar of medieval Kannada literature who also writes in English. And I was having tea with him at Koshi's, which is down the road. And he had gone for a conference in Heidelberg. And he met a mutual friend, and my friend wrote to me saying, I met your friend, Professor Gundur, and he called you his mentor. So the next time I met Gundur, I said, I'm not your mentor. I'm your older friend. You can call me sounding board. But I hesitate to have a mentor or to be a mentor. But having said that, my friendship with younger writers has profoundly influenced me and nourished me and educated me and encouraged me, and largely through those, I was privileged to work with the New India Foundation, but outside the New India Foundation too. And one of the reasons, Amit, my door is always open to a younger writer or scholar. Not a high school student who says, read my essay, but, a reasonably serious, focused writer who's written a PhD thesis or a draft of a book on, a topic on which I may have something to say. Because when I was young, doors were open for me. And not just by historians, but by scientists like Madhav Gadgil, whom I collaborated with, and so on. So I think it is enormously beneficial. I think to have these friendships across generations. In Dharma's case, of course, she was also a close relative. So that was the reason I got to know her. And then, of course, we found it was not just genes we had in common, but a certain sensibility, a way of looking at the world, and so on. But absolutely, I think I'll add one more thing. Amit, especially for your listeners. And it's friendships across generations and friendships across professions. It's probably different now. I think, to go back to your term fluid intelligence, I think young professionals have a much more fluid social life than people in my generation. So in my generation, if you were a doctor, you only hung around with doctors. If you're a lawyer, you only hung around with lawyers. If you're a civil servant, only with civil servants. Now I think probably there's much more, interpenetration of professions. But I think to have friends who are, in my case, who are entrepreneurs, who are lawyers, who are doctors, who are, of course, cricketers, musicians, I think really is a source of immense nourishment. And so across generations and across professions, I think both are equally valuable.
And tell me about sort of the role of her family in the way that she was shaped. You have a stirring passage about all the women in her family, where at one point you write, Dharma admired and respected her father's family, but warmed more to her mother's. For one thing, they were larger. Her mother was one of 6 sisters who, growing up in Bangalore, could be forward in ways that Brahmin girls in Madras could not. They spoke
Correct.
English and spoke their minds, rode on the pillions of their brothers' motorbikes, and in time encouraged the children to marry outside the bounds of caste and community. On this, her mother's side, Dharma was the eldest of 21 first cousins, not merely the eldest, but by common consent, the most beautiful, the most intelligent, and the most interesting. Stop quote. And when I do episodes with people whose mothers were from that generation, or the generation before that, what often strikes me is how the lives of women were so different, in the sense that any feminism that there was there would be in minor acts of rebellion, which today you would not consider feminism at all.
Yes.
Like riding on the pillions of the brother's bike, as you, mention. So give me a sense about, the milieu out of which she came, that the India of that time, the society of that time, it's a horrible place for women. And at the same time, she's fortunate to be in this family where it's looked upon differently. Give me a sense of how she was shaped from what you know of.
So I think, so as I said, Dharma's father's family was from Madras, as Chennai was then known. And they were moderately liberal by the Brahmin standards of the day, but still living in a Brahmin locality, Mylapore. And Tamil Brahmins from Chennai are even today pretty conservative, However, her mother's family had moved to Bangalore. So they'd moved out of the womb. And her maternal grandfather, who was actually my paternal grandfather, and whose name I carry, Ramachandra, was a doctor who went to study in Liverpool and then came back. And then during the First World War, served as a medical officer in Mesopotamia, as Iraq was once known, and was a football player. So he would play in a team with Jawans who were Sikhs and Muslims and so on and so forth, right? So I think that is the kind of atmosphere in which Dharma grew up. And she had these 6 aunts. I had those same 5 aunts, because her mother was one of the 6 sisters. I had the same set of aunts, and they were quite extraordinary. One I don't mention here. I'll just say a little bit about her, because I've been thinking a lot about her recently. My father's elder sister, so Dharma's mother's younger sister. Her name was Anasuya. Now, she went to Madras to study medicine. She grew up in Bangalore, not just riding pillion, but riding her own bike and so on. She went to Madras to study medicine. And in the first year of college, she had a romance with a Christian boy from Kerala. And we're talking about the 1940s, which a romance only means holding hands and walking to Marina Beach and a gentle peck on the cheek. But my grandfather, who was liberal enough for his daughters to be educated, didn't want an interreligious marriage. Intercaste was fine. So he withdrew her. So she came back to Bangalore, but was determined to heal people, and then became a nurse, a Brahmin woman becoming a nurse. And she went to London in the late 40s, a brown-skinned woman living alone in the post-war London, a period of covert racism, scarcity. And then she joined the Indian Army and became a senior nurse in the Indian Army, and was deputed by the Indian Army to Isfahan. Because the Red Crescent, which is the used to be the Islamic branch of the Red Cross, wanted nurses. So here is a Hindu kafir woman, technically born in a Brahmin family, working in Iran, attending to Muslim men and women and so on. And she was the most extraordinary woman, and she actually introduced me to both P.G. Woodhouse and Rex Stout. Okay, so two brilliant writers of very different genres, and she would, among other marks of her sterling independence, was that she smoked cigarettes. Okay, back in the 60s. So I think these are the kinds of aunts and cousins that Dharma had and I had, and of course she was much older than me. Her mother was, kind of from that same family, and she was of course an only child and a much beloved child. But even if she'd had a sibling who was a brother, there would have been absolutely no discrimination at all. So I think it was quite exceptional. I mean, when I reflect on that, my father's family and the women in that family, I mean, the other women who've gone on to do absolutely amazing things too. I mean, Dharma is just the best known. So yes, it was quite exceptional.
No, and some of these biographical details, if you apply them to a man, they would be interesting enough. But for a woman to do all of this is just absolutely mind blowing. It's.
In fact, one of the only countries I want to visit is Iran, because my aunt was in Isfahan, and Isfahan apparently has the most magical Islamic architecture too. But I think in the early 70s, firstly in the early 50s, a Brahmin woman going to study nursing in London. I mean, and nursing is absolutely transgressive for a Tamil Brahmin woman to attend to the bodies of men. It just, you can't conceive of, I mean, it's okay. That's why, because Christians are far less, Malayali Christians are far less bound by these kinds of awful caste stigmas. That's why you have so many Christian nurses. But for a Brahmin woman in the 50s, and then to join the army, and then to go to Iran to work, I mean, it is quite extraordinary.
It feels like the stuff of fiction. Yeah. So there's a beautiful anecdote I want to ask you about, where in your essay you write that when she was in school at the J.B. Petty High School, she did well in the matriculation exam, and her mom brought her a sari, and her father made her return the sari and said learning should be its own reward.
Yeah.
And this is a beautiful kind of story in terms of driving home a value. Like, I was doing an episode with Gurcharan Das recently, and he brought up the myth of Sisyphus, and I just thought aloud that if Sisyphus was rolling the rock up the hill to get the rock to the top of the hill, he was always going to be unhappy. But if he was rolling the rock up the hill to roll the rock up the hill, then his life would forever be fulfilled. So similarly, the phrase learning is its own reward. And that almost seems to be a theme that plays out through the rest of her life, that everything she is doing in a sense for the love of it, not to get ahead in the profession or in her career or whatever. And do you again think that these kind of values are something core to a person and she would have been this person anyway? Or do you think that...
No, I think there are two things. One is her family. So she was a remarkably independent-minded person anyway. So there are three things. One is her own character. The second is the immediate environment, which is a liberal, broad-minded, unprejudiced family. And the third is the Bombay of the 40s and the 50s. That Bombay has been lost.
Tell me about that Bombay.
Because it was extraordinarily cosmopolitan. I mean, Salman Rushdie kind of writes about it. And Dharma incidentally knew Rushdie's parents, because they stayed not far away in Bombay at one stage. But it's a Bombay in which, it's, as I said, it's cosmopolitan, Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, Christian. It's experimental, it's innovative, it's culturally effervescent with film and music and theatre. And of course, if you're a cricket lover, it's a centre of Indian cricket. It's got the most vigorous, active media, independent-minded newspapers, a great university at that stage. I mean, Bombay University was an outside university. So I think Bombay, Lahore is much eulogized. And Lahore was also a center of great creativity and so on, and innovation in the 30s and 40s. But it's much smaller than Bombay. So I think the Bombay of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s was by far the most interesting city in India. I mean, it's like... I think that it declined for many, many respects. All the power and prestige and money shifted towards Delhi. So the newspapers moved towards Delhi, and the publishing houses moved towards Delhi. But I think Dharma, the Bombay that shaped Dharma, is not dissimilar for some of your listeners who read Salman Rushdie to the Bombay that shaped Salman Rushdie, and for which he is unbelievably nostalgic. Just 3 days ago, I heard an interview he gave to Mishal Hussain. He has a new collection of short stories out, Rushdie, and one short story is set in Bombay, and he was saying, I wish I could go back there. And why did my parents move to Pakistan? And there's a lovely line, by the way, in his memoir, Joseph Anton, where he talks about his parents moving to Pakistan and settling in Karachi, for which he never forgave them. And then he says, uh, Karachi is to Bombay as Duluth is to New York. Okay. That's a fact. So that tells you, So I think the Bombay that Dharma was shaped by is also part of the story.
So tell me about the trajectory of her career, because it is fascinating. She goes abroad to study, she goes to England, and then she comes back, and you might imagine that, okay, she's got a job in the Reserve Bank of India, everything is set. But as you point out, that her job is just what she does during office hours. Outside that, she's running an art circle, she's writing about dance, she's contributing to the Economic Weekly, and more on that later. And, she's married Lavraj Kumar, but the young men of the city are still wooing her, which is
Yeah.
something that happened in England as well. So tell me about this phase of her life, and obviously you didn't know her then. But
Yeah, I didn't know
just,
that. Yeah,
just
so I
looking
mean,
back.
that's. But I'd say one thing about which I think is not in this essay, and even if it is, it bears repeating to your audience. Cambridge, when she went to Cambridge in '46 at the age of 18 on a troop ship. So a young woman, 18-year-old, beautifully 18-year-old Indian woman, going with demobilized soldiers, British soldiers, Tommies who were going back to their homeland. And she went there, did a tripos, and then worked in the Reserve Bank, and then returned later to do a PhD. But there is an episode, I think, probably from her second stint in the 50s when she was doing her PhD, which is described in Robert Skidelsky's great biography of Keynes, which I don't think I put in my essay. So Skidelsky is talking about discussions in a Cambridge pub. It's in the Cambridge pubs that the invention of DNA is discussed, and the general theory of Keynes, and the philosophy of Russell and Wittgenstein, and so on and so forth, right? And he's talking about this, and he says there's a famous Cambridge story. There's a debate in a Cambridge pub about the philosophical concepts of space and time. So space and time, those two philosophical concepts, and Dharma Kumar. Skidelsky writes, the economist Dharma Kumar interjected to say at one stage in the conversation, she interjected to say, I don't know about time. Space was a concept designed to make sure not everything was invented in Cambridge. Okay, so it's a brilliant remark, which also shows the Cambridge sense of self-regard. Ki sab yahi hota hai, we're the fountainhead of all that is original universe. So I think Cambridge mattered a lot to her, and then Bombay, and then of course later on in life, the period I knew was when she was at the Delhi School of Economics, which was then a really great public institution. Now, sadly fallen on bad ways, and It was the Delhi school that she taught in from 66 till the 90s was quite remarkable in several respects. One was it was extraordinarily pluralistic intellectually. So if you look at all around the world, if you look at most great economics departments, so Cambridge is historically Keynesian, Chicago is kind of neoclassical. The Jawaharlal Nehru University was resolutely Marxist. So the Delhi School had all kinds of interesting thinkers of all kinds of backgrounds. It was part of a larger university where you had sociologists like Andre Bete, historians like Romila Thapar, all in the same kind of campus. Legal scholars like Upendra Bakshi, musicians like T. N. Krishnan. So I think she, intellectually and wonderful students, she found her years at the Delhi School especially stimulating. And also when she was editing the Indian Economic and Social History Review, which I would say is arguably the only really world-class journal of history and sociology and humanities ever published out of India. So that's the time I knew her. So, I knew about her Bombay days and her Cambridge days through what she told me and what I read. But it was at a time when the University of Delhi was really at its peak. And that's what she loved most of all, going to the university, interacting with her students, organizing lectures, raising funds for needy students. The sense of community that the Delhi school and the university gave her, I think, is what is the time when I knew her. And of course, she was also a legendary hostess, because partly because her husband was a very respected technocrat and a pioneer of India's petrochemical revolution and India's first Rhodes Scholar and so on and so forth. So, there would be these parties where all kinds of quite remarkable people would be around, and I'd be a young boy sitting in the corner just soaking it all in. Yeah. And in her retirement, which is when I was staying with her, my wife and I were staying below her, that's when she started that wonderful and now sadly defunct journal Civil Lines. So in her retirement, she got interested in encouraging young writers and starting a literary journal. Yeah.
We'll talk about her intellectual life right after this, but first I want you to double click on how she was as a mentor of young people. Because even at DSE, you point out that she was always mentoring young people, mentoring students, nurturing them. Even in your descriptions of your interactions, you self-effacingly write about how you were a young, idealistic Marxist, almost doctrinaire in some ways, and etc. etc.
I actually was.
And she dealt with you very gently. She didn't berate you, she didn't tell you were wrong, she dealt with you very gently and helped you make that journey. And in retrospect, it must seem so kind and so wise to be able to treat a young person like that.
That's again because it goes with her aversion to the herd mentality. She liked engaging. She was a principled liberal. So she wrote the first article attacking the Rajiv Gandhi government for banning satanic verses. The first printed criticism of Rajiv Gandhi's action was Dharma Kumar's Indian Express. But at the same time, she abhorred Hindu fundamentalism. And after the destruction of the Babri Masjid, she raised money for a big ad in the Times of India signed by all kinds of luminaries about what this meant. I mean, the anti-Sikh riots, she, worked heroically to kind of arraign the culprits. But so she was a liberal. And she detested Marxism because she knew, as an economist, she knew state economics had problems. But also as a historian, she knew that for all their promise of liberty and freedom, Russia and China and Cuba and Vietnam, totalitarian states which choked their citizens. But a young man is idealistic. He thinks, revolution is going to change the world. She wants to engage with him. She wants to talk to him. She wants to find out why she respects why she may disagree with his views. She respects the fact that those views are arrived at through sincerity and passion, maybe misguided sincerity and passion. And I think she was wonderful with the young. I think that's what most people would remember about her.
Let's sort of talk about her intellectual independence. Like, early on she wrote Land and Caste in South India, which in a sense went against a myth that was common to both nationalists and Marxists, that, British rule had destroyed the organic village community and otherwise it was fine. That's what created the polarized society of landowners and laborers, as you put it. And she pointed out that no, it was much more deep-rooted than that. And in a sense, in writing that book, she goes against the dogmas of the past. Similarly, later, you talk about her stands against both the Mandal Commission and the destruction of the Babri Masjid, where you write, quote, with her characteristic incisiveness, she drew attention to the parallels between the case for Mandal and the case for the demolition of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. Both rested on the desire for historical retribution. But in a secular democracy, now her words, political issues should depend on current laws, not in ancient history. And back to your words, and if one insisted that Brahmins were responsible for the sins of their forefathers, there was no stopping radical Hindus from blaming the Muslims of today for the extremism of some Muslim rulers of the past, stop quote. And this again is an act of principled independence, because she is just going by the principles, and this is an utterly coherent position.
Yes, and it's so prescient. If you look at the demonizing of Aurangzeb today, it's so utterly prescient.
And the herds on the different sides will all hold incoherent positions because they will either be for one or against the other. And yet she is just coming at it from a principled level.
So I wonder, of course, she was, as I said, a thoroughgoing liberal, a principled liberal. She might attribute some of that to her scientist father. Logic, precision, analytical sharpness, no pussyfooting, no equivocation. It may have if I had pressed her to it. But let me say one thing at this stage. I mean, she was an extraordinary woman, and of course, influenced me so deeply and profoundly that I write about her with such affection and regard and at times reverence. But I should also point to the fact that she never published very much. After that landmark first spoke Land and Caste in South India, she wrote a series of essays that were later collected in a book called Colonialism, Property in the State. She edited a journal. She was a conscientious teacher. But she knew, I mean, again, if there are younger writers who are listening to this podcast, she knew towards the end of her life, and she told me that given her extraordinary intelligence, her wide-ranging interests, her independence of mind, her command over the English language, she should have written much more. And she once told me, she said, writing requires solitude. And I don't like solitude. I like being in the classroom with students. I like being in a conference debating and arguing. I like being in a party, chatting and gossiping. So I think in that sense, Dharma and Andre Bete, who are very close friends, temperamentally they were different because one welcomed solitude and the other disdained solitude. And it's no accident that the one who welcomed solitude actually wrote much more. And the one who disdained solitude could have written an equal number of weighty books. And she knew that towards the end of her life. She would tell me often, that, the problem is that I don't like solitude and writing requires solitude.
What I find incredibly sad is when you speak about how she loved to be among people, she mentored so many people, and yet, right at the end of her life, when she was recovering from the brain surgery and stuff, when she wasn't mobile or particularly articulate, that so many people just left her alone, and it's almost as if the halls which were once full of bustling conversation just emptied out, and that just made me so mad and sad to read.
People who had eaten her food, drunk her whiskey, been gifted books by her, got foreign scholarships from her because of her lobbying and her contacts. But that is Delhi, I suppose.
Is it Delhi or is it human nature?
It is Indian nature, human nature, but in Delhi, whatever, yeah. Maybe it's just human nature, yeah.
Tell me about her as a woman. Like, there's this very charming quote where she writes to Mary Calder, where she says, quote, "We are actually much luckier than men. We can do all the things they do, such as hold jobs and write books, but we can buy lovely clothes and have babies too," stop
Yes.
quote. And when we look back on someone as an intellectual, and she was a great intellectual, a great teacher, etc., all those angles come out. But how did you know her as a woman? Because the rest of your heroes that we'll be speaking about today are men, and
All
we can
men,
discuss why also.
Yeah.
But she would have been fundamentally different from them, not just because everybody's unique, of course, but also because she was a woman. So give me a sense of...
Yeah, I think, as we've discussed earlier in this conversation, she, because of the family background in which she was reared, she grew up thinking women are the equal of men. They can do exactly what other men do, and later on acquire beautiful saris and have babies too. My wife, who was very close to her, interestingly, I'll just say something about Dharma. Dharma had very few women friends. She preferred the company of men, younger men. And among the few women she genuinely liked and admired were my wife Sujata, who was a designer and who also lived in the same house, Dharma, and a well-known editor whom you may have known of, who used to work with Outlook and Penguin, called Nandini Mehta. So there are actually very few women she liked. I mean, there were one or two great Western scholars. There was a great Western scholar of Japanese culture called Carmen Blacker, who was a Cambridge friend. But generally, she kind of hung around with men. And I think it may be that she wanted to test her mettle with men and always show herself to be equal with men. But reflecting on her life, it's odd that it's kind of interesting, because actually that is also in its own way quite rare and exceptional for an Indian woman of that generation to have so many male friends. And not male romantic friends. I mean, there may have been one or two male romantic friends too, but they were just one or maybe two, right? Whereas you had 80 or 90 really good male friends who were not just Indian. Firstly, they were of all ages. They were of all professions. They were people in the law, in medicine, in academics, in the civil service, in the diplomatic corps. So she had a great capacity of friendship. But when I reflect on her life, it strikes me that it's interesting that there were very few women friends. I mean, the proportion of close men friends to women friends was kind of maybe 10-1 or maybe even 15-1. And in most other people, you won't find that asymmetry.
Is a reason I'm thinking aloud, so I obviously this will be simplistic, but I'm just wondering if one reason for that asymmetry is also the very reason that so many of your heroes happen to be men. Not that you are biased or she was biased, but that there is an upstream problem, that because of the way society was in the past, most people in these intellectual pursuits just happen to be men.
Men.
So what do
That's
you do?
true. Absolutely, yeah. That's the most likely explanation.
I want to also know about a little bit more about the magazine she founded and the intellectual ecosystem of the times. Like in a different essay, which when we'll talk about Krishna Raj, but in your essay on him, you quoted H.L. Mencken at the start, where you said a magazine is a despotism or it is nothing. One man and one man alone must be responsible for all its essential contents. And he might as well have said one woman and one woman alone, because she started two journals, the Indian Economic and Social History Review, and of course Civil Lines.
So she started Civil Lines. She did not start Indian Economic and Social Review.
But she ran it for like 20
She
years.
ran it for, it was started by Tapan Roy Chaudhary, who the year after he started it decamped to a job in Oxford. So then she ran it for the next 30 years. But I think there's a difference between the journals Dharma ran and the EPW. The EPW is a weekly journal of politics. I mean, so it has the editor has to have a very close, almost authoritarian hand over it. The ISHR was a quarterly, so there's more time to be consultative and collaborative. Also, because it's a scholarly journal, it needs feedback. Now, if you're editing a weekly magazine, you can decide what goes in and what doesn't go in. And sometimes you'll make horrible mistakes. But generally, you want to follow your gut instinct. But if you're editing a scholarly journal and you're your own expertise, Dharma was a historian of economic and social historian of modern India. But if there is a submission on the Mauryas, or a submission on the Portuguese expansion into India, you want to consult an expert. So in a sense, because the nature of the magazine she ran were different from a political weekly. I mean, Mencken, like Krishna Raj, was running a political magazine or a newspaper where there has to be one clear boss. I think her style was, she was in command, but not authoritarian. But she had some very impressive ground rules. One was no personal remarks. You write a review. I remember once there was a young scholar who wrote a book on the breakdown of the Mughal Empire. I could take names, but I won't. He's no longer young. He's a distinguished professor in America now. This was like 35, 40 years ago. And the greatest living Indian medieval historian, who was 30 years older than that scholar, was asked to review the book. And while reviewing the book, he said, so-and-so has written, following his Cambridge mentors, has provided this shady explanation of the breakdown of the Mughal Empire. So Dharma wrote to him and said, you cannot, it's his book under his name. You can't say he's following a line laid down by, and in the kind of xenophobic climate of India, it means Cambridge mentor, wo sale gora ki baat sun raha hai. And she said, we don't allow personal remarks, and that is, you have to keep it scholarly. You can accept or debunk an argument you cannot insinuate motives. So I think that is something that is so rarely followed in Indian public discourse, where we are always attributing motives. He is doing this because he owes something to him or to her, or somebody has instructed him. So I think that kind of scrupulousness, and is also a sign of intellectual integrity, which I learned from her.
You mentioned that you used to live below her, and often you were party to the early editorial meetings of Civil Lines, where Rukun and Mukul and Ivan were also there. So, tell me about these meetings. What were these meetings like? Was it clear that, what are the roles that these different people played in them? How did she?
I think I can say it frankly. So, Ivan Hutniks supplied the name, which is an absolutely brilliant name, Civil Lines. Okay, it's a brilliant name. He supplied the name. Mukul supplied the conversation. I mean, Mukul, and he's such a brilliant turn of phrase and the wit. Dharma supplied the ideas and the funding, and Rukun did the hard work of editing. So I think Dharma and Rukun really made it happen. But again, if you look at Civil Lines, which I think there were just 5 issues of Civil Lines, but they first published Ruchi Joshi, Siddharth Deb, Susan Vishwanathan. I mean, I'm now blanking, but at least five or six other writers who then became extremely well known. So it had a fantastic success rate, so it was a wonderful little magazine, and I wish it had carried on. Yeah.
Tell me about
And it had these gorgeous photographs by Sanjeev Seth on the cover also.
Tell me about the intellectual ecosystem of those times, because when I read about Dharma and all of these people, they almost seem outliers, because 95% of people would pretty much be following the herd mentality. They'd be going through the motions. They could be slaves to an ideological fashion, or in the way of so much academia, they could be specialists trapped in a silo and not be people of breadth. And so what was the intellectual ecosystem like?
Yeah, so I spoke a little about Bombay. So if you leave out the sciences, I mean, Bangalore is the place which is for many decades now been the capital and the center of creative work in the sciences. But if you think of the humanities and the social sciences, there've been three cities through the 20th century that have produced at different periods of time truly innovative and intellectual work. The first was Calcutta. Now, Calcutta was, and I'd say Calcutta from maybe the 20s and 30s to the 60s. Now, Calcutta was distinctive, different from any other city in India, in that high quality intellectual work was done in English and in Bangla. So the great Calcutta intellectuals, not just writers like Tagore, but later on, the economists and the historians and the philosophers were writing in English and in Bangla. But set against this extraordinary advantage it had was one great disadvantage, that it was essentially a Bengali city where almost all the intellectuals were Bengali. I mean, Raman left Calcutta to come here because he found it, too claustrophobic, and Radhakrishnan did the same thing. So then there was Bombay, which was, I think, which we've spoken about. And from the 60s, it was Delhi. So it's post-independence, Delhi is the capital. Lahore has declined. So Delhi has become the kind of most vibrant intellectual center of northern India. There's funding from the government, and so on and so forth. The publishing houses have come there. So I think the Delhis of the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s had, this extraordinarily vibrant intellectual life. The three universities in Delhi, which are the three major universities, which are Delhi University, JNU, and Jamia, all have different origins in how they are founded. But all were truly all Indian. So they had a clientele, a student and faculty clientele from all over India, which set them apart from Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, and so on. Then you had some first centers of research. So the Institute of Economic Growth, which did very important work in economics. The Center for Study of Developing Societies with Ashish Nandi and Rajni Kothari, which did amazing work on political culture. You had publishing houses, the Oxford University Press, and so on and so forth. Then the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, a great archival center and a hub of seminars and scholarships and debates. And of course, a time when, unlike today, the country was not so xenophobic. So the country was welcoming foreign scholars coming. So you had a steady stream of brilliant thinkers from all over the world coming, giving seminars at the Delhi School, giving seminars at JNU, giving seminars at the Tirmurti Bhavan. And that's what it was like. So it was, I was really very lucky to be reared in that culture, because I was a student in Delhi University, 74 to 79. I was always there in the 80s as a doctoral researcher. I was living there in the 90s. And I think it was in that kind of milieu that Dharma really flourished, because Delhi had comprehensively replaced Calcutta and Bombay as the crucible of really original work in the humanities and social sciences. And she was running this great journal, she was well connected. She was a wonderful hostess. Everyone wanted to, have dinner at her place because you'd meet the most interesting guests, both Indian and foreign. So that's really what it was. And I was I would say I was a fly on the wall. I was a young man occasionally asked by Dharma to serve the drinks and, get a couple of my young friends over for dinner.
So you said 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and in a sense that also kind of corresponds with the end of her time.
Yeah.
So why do you end that period there? Why did Delhi stop being vibrant? What happened?
I think later on comes political interference, the Hindu right, the dynastic politics of the Congress. But I think also what had happened from I said, from the 70s onward, there was a steady stream of, which was a trickle and then became a flood, of brilliant Indian minds leaving for greener pastures overseas. You know, after independence, many people who had done their PhDs in Cambridge and Harvard and Princeton wanted to come back and build this new nation. But by the 80s, that dream had kind of soured. So I think, people started leaving. And that's probably one reason.
So let's talk about another of your heroes now, Krishna Raj. So, tell me about the difference that the magazine like the Economic Weekly, and which was later called the Economic and Political Weekly, EPW, made to that intellectual landscape. Because you look at a landscape and you tend to take all of it for granted. And yet, things like, the One magazine, which was part of that ecosystem, can make so much of a difference and be like a bulwark or a scaffolding, for a lot of what goes on. So tell me about the role that you feel that that EPW played in India's intellectual discourse, especially in
It was
economics and
really a
politics.
mirror to all that was going on in the Republic. It was founded in 1949 as the Economic Weekly by Sachin Chaudhary, and then became the Economic and Political Weekly in 1966. And I, of course, started reading it in the late 70s and started writing for it in the early to mid 80s. But it was absolutely unique. I mean, it still appears weekly. In my view, it's a pale shadow of its former self. But it was unique because it had four distinct sections. Either you have weeklies, political weeklies like The Nation, The New Statesman, in the old days, India Today, Outlook, or whatever, before the rise of Godi media, or you have scholarly magazines, scholarly journals. Here you had a magazine that combined editorials, field reportage, book reviews, and scholarly essays all in one. And every issue had 3 or 4 pieces you wanted to read. And you had correspondence from all over India and all over the world. And again, though it was called Economic and Political Weekly, you also had sociology, history, literature. I mean, the bias was economics. So I would say economics 50%, politics 20% perhaps. And the already arranged. So, it has, again, we are talking about a time long before social media, long before television, where if you want to know about what is happening in Chhattisgarh or Nagaland, you can't get it from the Times of India or the Hindu. And the EPW would have correspondents and reporters in every single part of India. So it was really a mirror to the nation. And it had the best intellectuals writing in it. So, Sen or Bhagwati or Srinivas or Andre Bete, Irfan Abhi, Romila Thapar, they were all writing in it. And it had younger writers coming through, like when I started writing. And, my first essay was published in EPW. I was hardly known. I got there completely by chance. Somebody told Krishna Raj about my work. And then Krishna Raj was the kind of guy talking about mentors and, the discovery of young talent. Krishna Raj was very good at identifying and publishing younger writers. Once those younger writers had become slightly mature, they became his talent scouts. So by the time I was in my 30s and 40s, I was tasked with Krishna Raj with finding writers younger writers who could make their first debut appearance in the EPW. So it was, and I'll tell you a story about EPW, what it meant. There was a scholar, historian of South India, now sadly deceased, my generation, but he died young. He died in his late 50s, called M.S.S. Pandian. And he wrote a biography of MGR. He wrote one of the first books, a cultural biography of MGR. He had written the Dravidian movement and so on. He's a well-known historian of South India. And we hadn't met for many years because he lived in Madras, I lived in Calcutta, then Delhi and so on. And in the mid-90s, so I knew him in the 70s and early 80s, and we hadn't met for about 15 years. I think 96 or 97, I was visiting the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And Pandian was a fellow there that year. And we met, and he said, Ram, we haven't met. Actually, we haven't met. We've been meeting each other through the pages of EPW. So I know what you've been thinking, you know what I've been thinking. So it was a kind of, today we talk about a virtual community, but EPW created that virtual community.
So I have a little story for you about EPW, and it's a fascinating counterfactual that involves my not existing. So in the early 1960s, or close to the mid 1960s, my father fell in love with a Bengali woman who would later become my mother, and there was great pressure on him to take up a job. And now around this time, also he had job offers from Citibank and whatever was the biggest First National Citibank as it was then called, some big ad agency, and EPW or the Economic Weekly. He met Sachin Chaudhary, and Sachin Chaudhary really took a shine to him and said that, listen, why don't you come and work with me? And you come and work with me and I'll groom you, and maybe one day you can be the editor. Who knows? So why don't you do that? So my father went for a month or two, but then he missed my, his then the love of his life and later his wife terribly. So he decided that screw it, I really have to get married. I need to get a job. He gave the IAS exam, got through the IAS, and that was it. He was, So, but the counterfactual is that he decided to stay on, and I am never born, of course, but it's a very interesting counterfactual.
Did you ever talk about it?
He did speak about it because, before he died, I sat down with him and my thinking was I have long conversations with the rest of the world. For God's sake, I got to have it with my own dad. So he spoke a lot about his life, and I sense this wistfulness that was there because life
what
can
we
take
really
such...
need is a great history of the EPW.
Mm.
And, of course, you won't have private papers, but oral memories and the whole archive is around, So the history of India through the history of EPW.
Would be amazing if someone is listening to this and wants to take it up. I want to also ask you about the role that a magazine like that plays in a time like this. Like at one point you write, as a historian Christopher Lasch pointed out, with the onset of television and the dumbing down of the mass media, these journals had become, quote, the only surviving media in which scholars can talk to each other. They give the intellectual community what little unity and coherence it retains, stop quote. And I don't know when Lasch wrote these words or when you wrote this essay, but oh my God, is it truer than ever before today in these modern times? So what is your sense of the... you already mentioned that, you and MSS Pandian were kind of in conversation through the magazine. It was like a community talking to each other, a longer discourse that is going on. But is there an equivalent of that in modern times? And do you feel a lack of that? Is there a hole in the universe that something...
So I think... of course, it's a moot point given the ubiquity of the smartphone and short attention spans of people, whether whether you can have a magazine like that. But EPW has rapidly declined, and we won't go into that. I have, written about in the past. But essentially EPW has had three outstanding editors. So Sachin Chaudhary from 1949 till 1966, Krishna Raj from 1966 to 2004. And Krishna Raj was succeeded by a very able man called Ram Manohar Reddy, who ran it for about 15 years and then left. And in the 5 years since, EPW has had, I think, 5 editors.
Wow.
But Ram Reddy has started an online magazine called the India Forum, which I would strongly recommend to your viewers, because as EPW has declined, some of the slack, not all of the slack, but a substantial amount of the slack has been picked up by the India Forum, which doesn't have scholarly articles, but it has long informed essays by the finest scholars of India on health, on culture, on economics, on federalism, on the environment. And it doesn't obviously have the reach of the EPW, but it has the quality of what the EPW once was. So I would recommend, serious-minded listeners to your program, Amit, who are interested in current affairs, politics, sociology, economics, history, to subscribe to the India Forum. I think it's free up to a point, and they won't be disappointed.
I also want to ask you about little magazines, which was a phrase I actually last remember hearing maybe some 20-25 years ago with good reason. And you write, in the words of the critic Dwight MacDonald, a little magazine is often more intensively read and circulated than the big commercial magazines, being a more individual expression and so appealing with a special force to individuals of the minds. His quote ends, you continue, these journals are to be judged not by the bottom line, but by their often considerable impact on shaping public policy and public debate, and beyond that, even by the love and loyalty of their readers, stop quote. And, in the case of my own podcast, one quote that I've taken really to heart is something that Paul Graham says in the context of startups, but I feel it applies to me, is that it is better to be loved by a few than liked by many. And I think that,
absolutely,
like the EPW would certainly have been loved by a few rather than liked by many, a lot of great a lot of the work of great scholars, including some of the people that you speak about, like D.R. Nagaraj, who we'll come to later,
Yeah.
like Dharma Kumar, would be loved by a few, but they wouldn't be, mass mainstream names.
Yeah.
So, in the context, and you've actually, in a sense, been fortunate to have been loved by many, which is, it's a, breakthrough if you make. But what do you really think about that? And then do you think that it is a preference that serious scholars have to make to be able to continue to do serious work, that they choose this? They choose that, okay, we won't get the scale, but we'll do the kind of work we want to
And
do
you
with
know,
intensity.
there's a line of the writer Arthur Koestler to the effect that I will exchange 1,000 readers of my book today for 10 readers in 10 years' time and 1 reader in 100 years' time. Okay. Now that kind of, expresses some of what you're saying. But little magazines, what the quote from Dwight MacDonald, little magazines have intensity, a kind of profound influence on shaping people's minds. And that is, cumulative and incremental. It goes, and it is, you say, slow burning. It's not, attracting dramatic attention very quickly and to lots of people. But now, when I wrote those essays, that essay I wrote on EPW is at least 15 years old. The world has changed so much, Amita. I wonder, given digital media and the decline of print and the smartphone and Instagram and, people clicking from one thing to the other, how this culture of slow, reflective reading can be renewed. I mean, I'm actually quite despairing. I mean, if I go on a flight nowadays, 10 years ago, 10% of the aircraft would be reading a book. Now you'd be lucky if you find one person, right? And of course, what you get from a book is has a slower but much more enduring impact than anything you can get from an Instagram post or a game you play on your smartphone or possibly even a film you watch, right? An action film you watch. But I maybe the time for all of this has passed. I don't know whether I can come back.
I mean, I'll push back slightly on the short attention span comment that you make and say that while it's true that a lot of the time we are scrolling, swiping, at the same time, is there, when people want to go deep, they do go deep. Like I experience this personally with the Seen and the Unseen, where I've had episodes which are 8, 9, 10 hours long and people do listen. Or just consider how people will binge watch a TV series where for 5 or 6 hours they'll just be basically watching one long film playing out. And that wasn't there in the past.
But I mean, books and serious magazines, print is declining. I mean, to spend time, I'm now at the moment, and to read a work of serious and rigorous scholarship and to be able to assimilate say 70% of what it says requires such close, focused, concentrated reading that you can't read more than 20-30 pages a day. So I'm now reading a book, a magnificent book by the late Iranian historian Roy Motadeh. It's called The Mantle of the Prophets. So it's a religious and political history of Iranian Shiism from the medieval period to Ayatollah Khomeini. And it's utterly brilliant. But I have to find every day an hour to read 20 pages. And many days today I couldn't find that hour. And if I, who is in the business of reading and writing, can't find the time because of so many other preoccupations, what about the others? So I think, anyway, I don't want to be utterly despairing, but even, Amit, I feel... My wife and I were discussing it this morning. Podcasts are used, a 1-hour podcast. I mean, not like yours, a data, but you say a 1-hour podcast. Nowadays, you have 45-minute podcasts with the author of a book. And the person who hears it says, "Ye maine sun liya hai, to kitab padhne ki kya zarurat hai?" I know the salient arguments of the book. So, yes, let's see. I mean, maybe slow reading will come back, but...
So, no, I mean, I broadly kind of agree with you and share the lament, but also it is a fact that there was a meme on Twitter a while back, Seen Unseen bookshelves, which has, people sharing all the books they've bought because they've heard my show.
Wonderful.
And someone's recommended a book because I have very exhaustive show notes.
That's a good thing about it,
yeah. So there are, but again, it's a selection effect. Maybe it's just a few people who happen to read, and maybe you're right about the larger trend. Here's my question. If that larger trend is correct, that less and less people are reading, that earlier 10 people in a flight used to read, now one person does.
Yes.
What is the impact of that on our discourse, on our thinking? That less people are reading, and therefore that capacity of sitting with a book for a while and really taking it in is just gradually disappearing. What is the impact of that at a social level, do you think?
I mean, I think this will have to be studied. The psychologist can answer it, but I haven't really reflected on it. I mean, I'm just superficially observed the phenomenon.
Let's go back to Krishna Raj. Tell me more about him. Like, it's very interesting how he reaches out to you. You describe beautifully that one day you're walking past the cabin of Nirmal Chandra, the economist, and he calls you, and he doesn't really know you, but he calls you and he says, "Look, here's a letter. This must be for you." And it is this, one of those postcards, green postcards,
Green Indian letters.
Green Indian letter from Krishna Raj to him saying that, "Hey, there's a young scholar who writes on these things. Can you ask him to get in touch with me?" and etc., which is such a delightful way of looking for young writers, finding them, etc. Take me through the rest of your association with him and give me a sense through that of what he was as, and these are really two separate questions, what he was as an editor, in terms of building that ecosystem of writers and the kind of discourse he promoted, and then also what he was like as a person, because you also pointed out that you had various fights with him for long periods of time. You didn't speak to each other.
So, I mean, I'll go back to how he discovered me and I discovered him. So, I was working in the National Library in Calcutta, which is this wonderful old building in Alipur. I was looking at some old documents on forests. And next to me was an American scholar who was looking at some old documents on the history of irrigation. So, he was working on the history of irrigation in 19th century Bengal. I was working on the history of forests in Garhwal, but the documents happened to be here in this library. So we started talking at tea, and I was then even more garrulous and excitable than I am now. And he went back to Bombay. He had already, his name was James Boyce. He was then later a distinguished professor at University of Massachusetts. And he told Krishna Raj, there's a young guy there. I think he's from IIM Calcutta. He's finding some amazing stuff on forests, but I forgot his name. And that was it. And Krishna Raj wrote to Nirmal Chandra, who was a professor in my institute, and said there's a young man there and who's working on forests. Now, that's how I was published by the EPW. And no one had written on the history of forests before. My essay which appeared in 1983 on the history of forests and social protests in India, is still cited, and people still meet me and tell me, recently I met a namesake of yours who's a well-known wildlife filmmaker called Kalyan Verma. And he told me, "Sir, that essay of yours published in 1983 inspired me to take to wildlife." So it's all because of James Boyce, the National Library, and Krishna Raj. So then I started writing, and then of course I would go to meet him in Bombay, and it was a pilgrimage. So he had an office not far from VT station, in the splendidly named Shahid Bhagat Singh Marg, Skylark building in Shahid Bhagat Singh Marg, and you would take the lift to the 5th floor, and he had a tiny cabin. I mean, it was not like an air-conditioned cabin. It was open and piled up with books and papers, and it was really a pilgrimage going there. And he was a very shy, reticent man. He was a very good-looking man, by the way. Very good-looking man. Didn't talk very much. Preferred communicating through those green Indian letters. Then we had a couple of fights. I'll tell you about the fights also. That will interest you. The more interesting one, I'll tell you, was linked to Dharma Kumar. So when Dharma Kumar died, she was very ill in the last years of her life. And she had a brain operation that went awry, and one of her friends when she was young, which is kind of testimony to her broad-mindedness, was the well-known Marxist economist Ashok Mitra, who was the long-serving finance minister of West Bengal. So Ashok Mitra wrote a piece in EPW saying, "Oh, my friend Dharma Venkatraman, she was charming and beautiful and so intelligent, and now I am told she has become a vegetable." But this was printed, this came in print. So I told Krishna Raj, you have to issue an editorial disclaimer. But Ashok Mitra was an old friend of his, and Ashok Mitra was on the board of the EPW, so the disclaimer was not issued. So I said, "I'm not going to write for you ever again." So for 3 or 4 years, I didn't write for him. And then I realized that, The EPW could do without me, but I couldn't do without the EPW. And then I wrote to him, and then he said, the fight we had was good for the EPW, because I think he recognized allowing a phrase like, "Oh, she has become a vegetable to go," which may have been okay in, as Donald Trump would say, locker room talk of the 1920s, was totally inappropriate in a serious journal. Yeah, so that's how. So the fight was about this description of Dharma Kumar by Ashok Mitra. There was another fight. I forget what the cause of that was. But yeah, I mean, it was a community where you read and you interacted and you debated, and it was always a special thrill to get that Green Inland. And the Green Inland would sometimes be, "You haven't written for us for some time. Do you have an essay for us?" Or it would be, and actually I cherish the second kind of inland even more. I am looking for a young writer who knows, who can write about the history of the Dravidian movement for me. Can you recommend someone? So that was like the kind of Green Inland you would get. And yeah, I mean, you live in Bombay, so Bombay is, as I once said in an article for Time Out when Naresh Fernandez used to edit it. To me, Bombay is one of the world's three great cities, which is New York, London, and Bombay. So for a boy from Dehradun to we take a train to VT station from Andheri, where my uncle lived, and then land up at Shahid Bhagat Singh Marg to meet the editor of the EPW. It was really a thrill.
And the Green Inland letter is such a metaphor of a time gone by, because it is not just something that is physically being sent, but it's a sign of intent. You only, make that effort if you really want to send a letter. It's a sign of saying that I care about this and I care about you. You're actually making that physical effort.
And he would be writing, Amit, dozens of those letters every day.
Amazing.
Because they were typed. He would type them on the internet, because, to different contributors, sometimes answering irate authors whose articles hadn't been published or had been published with misprints, and he was writing dozens. And it was like I remember he got a prize. He had Amit. He sat in one of those old-fashioned wooden chairs with that kind of netting, with a hard back, stiff back, and he worked in that. And he got a prize once, the B.D. Goenka Prize, which was a prize for the best editor. And I think it was not insubstantial. It was like 50,000 rupees in those days. And I wrote a column about, I said, this is he's an utterly deserving candidate. He's not, the editor of a big Delhi magazine or newspaper, but all he's done. And then I described his office. And I said, I hope with the prize money, Krishnaraj buys himself a comfortable chair. I said, at least, I doubt he did that. He would have given it to the office fund. But I remember saying that. I described his chair, and I said, I hope he buys himself a comfortable chair.
So a little bit of trivia for you, that, in your essay, you did not name Ashok Mitra. You just wrote a Calcutta Marxist wrote that she was a vegetable. And it just made me so mad that I was like, I have to find out who this is. So I went to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT 5.2 is just out. So I asked it the question, which Calcutta Marxist wrote of Dharma Kumar becoming a vegetable while she was still alive? So first, though, it quoted you and it said that you haven't named the person. Then I said, do what it takes. Give me an educated guess. So then it said that since this is not documented explicitly anywhere, the only honest way to answer is to triangulate carefully and then give you a probabilistic, not definitive answer. Then it gave me a reasoning. Then it shortlisted 3 people.
Let's
say
all 3.
Yeah. And then it finally said that Ashok Mitra is the best guess. And it said why. The other 2 were Barun Day and Amya Kumar Bagchi, but it said it is very unlikely to be any of them. It gave the reasons why.
Wow,
and it came up with Ashok Mitra. So I'm just so impressed
at
that.
Good for ChatGPT 5.2.
Yeah. So I'm going to, in fact, I'll make it shareable and link it from the show notes just because.
Yeah.
Tell me about you've described his austerity like in your essay as well, and how I think.
And he would take you're talking about editors who fly business class and he would take a train from VT to wherever he lived, which is somewhere in the suburbs, Santa Cruz or Andheri or somewhere.
And you mentioned something in 2002, circa that time, he got a salary of 12,000, 18. There's some pitiful amount you mentioned, which eventually was doubled to bring him on par with professors. Is it the case that there is a correlation between one's personal values and a person as an intellectual? Because you would imagine that a certain kind of probity will also correlate in some way with intellectual honesty. I'm thinking aloud that how do you think
Not always.
Not always.
Dharma like nice saris.
Okay.
She liked beautiful paintings. She had a beautiful pichwai in her dining room.
So maybe she wasn't austere, but I'm sure she was principled.
Yeah, principle, but yes, yeah.
Fair enough. So let's take a quick break now, and on the other side of the break, we'll talk about some other heroes of yours.
Long before I was a podcaster, I was a writer. In fact, chances are that many of you first heard of me because of my blog India Uncut, which was active between 2003 and 2009 and became somewhat popular at the time. I loved the freedom the form gave me, and I feel I was shaped by it in many ways. I exercised my writing muscle every day and was forced to think about many different things because I wrote about many different things. Well, that phase in my life ended for various reasons, and now it is time to revive it. Only now I'm doing it through a newsletter. I have started the India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com, where I will write regularly about whatever catches my fancy. I'll write about some of the themes I cover in this podcast and about much else. So please do head on over to indiauncut.substack.com and subscribe. It is free. Once you sign up, each new installment that I write will land up in your email inbox. You don't need to go anywhere. So subscribe now for free. The India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com. Thank you.
Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm still sitting here with Ram Guha, showing endless patience, which historians should have, I guess. And now let's talk
Lovers
about...
of Test cricket should have.
Lovers of Test cricket should also have, yeah. Do they still play Test cricket? I don't know. Let's see if by the time I'm your age, Test cricket will still be around. But one hopes so. Like I said, hey, if people can listen to 10-hour episodes, why not? Let's talk about another historian, another hero of yours, who you first encountered repeatedly in the UP State Archives before actually meeting him in person. So tell me the story of those early encounters.
Yeah, so I was doing a PhD on the history of peasant movements in Uttarakhand, and the Uttarakhand, Garhwal and Kumaon. These are hill areas where there's a close relationship between peasants and forests, because many, which a relationship that is economic, cultural, spiritual. And when the state took over the forests and deprived the peasants access to forest produce and forest rights, there were a series of protests, and that was my doctoral research. So I was working in the UP State Archives because Uttarakhand was part of Uttar Pradesh in those days, and this was in Lucknow. And in the pre-digital age, you ordered a file, and when the file came, so the file would have been titled "Disturbances in the Forest in the year 1920 in Garhwal Division," for example. You would order it because it seemed of interest. At the back of the file would be the names of all those who had ordered the file before you. And I was ordering all kinds of files on labor, on forests, on agriculture, on legal changes. And then one name was always there before me, and that was Shekhar Pathak. And I said, I must track this guy because, he's got similar interest to mine. And finally, I was able to get his address, and I landed up in Nainital and walked into his office. He was teaching in a college there. And there he was he's surrounded by students. And I said, Mera naam ye hai, main yahan se aaya hu. And, my Hindi is not what it should be. And our conversation still, even now, is kind of 60% Hindi and 30 or 40% English. And he realized that this guy is, serious about his research. And he told his students, "Tum baad mein aao. I can chat about you." These are all BA students. And chaliye hum ghar chalte hain, hum khana khayenge. And then we walked back to his house and we spent 3 hours talking about research. And it was an enthralling conversation and the beginning of a friendship which has now lasted 43 years. Our research was, he was working on movements against forced labor, and I was working on movements against state forestry, and they kind of intersected in many parts. He had then just started a journal called Pahad, which is an annual, and Pahad is an acronym, People's Association of Himalaya Area Research. And I was made an honorary a member of the editorial board. We are very different in temperament. So firstly, we are very different in social background because I'm anglicized. I'm from the Doon School. He's from a village called Ganguli Hat. I studied in St. Stephen's. He studied in Almora, DSB College, Almora. We are also different in the fact that he's an indefatigable field worker. He's always loafing. He has been to Kailash Mansarovar 6 times. He has been to every village, every valley in Uttarakhand. He's checked in Ladakh, in Budak, in Bhutan, in Arunachal. He's always on the move. And I'm really a kind of an archive rat who's a scholar who works with documents and so on, and mostly based in the cities. Occasionally season my life with a few days in the countryside. And we've had this long correspondence, and one of the talking about postcards and Indian letters in Krishna Raj, one of the postcards I got from him I deeply cherish, which is when I was going to Ecuador for a conference. I'd been invited to a conference in Ecuador, so I told him, and he sent back a postcard saying, "Andes Parvat ko Himalaya ka pranam." Which was just gorgeous, which is kind of a sign of his spontaneous wit and humor. And many years later, I had the privilege of editing his classic work on the Chipko movement, helping with the translation and bringing it out in English. And in a long essay in the introduction, that book got the Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay Prize for the best book, non-fiction book that year. I described our relationship and how it unfolded. And I said, he is the brother I have never had. And unbeknownst to me, he had written a foreword to the English edition, where he had talked about my chastising him for many years to write a definitive history of Chipko. And there he said, he has been like a brother to me. So, it is, my children used to joke. I was, about this, my claiming he was my brother, because I have a sister, I have no brothers. I was once, just down the road from here, Amit, is a restaurant called Sunny's. Have you ever been there? It's a very nice
I
restaurant,
can't recall. I should go
So,
there.
we were having dinner, and about 6-7 years ago, Sujata and I and our children were having dinner, and Shekhar's call came. So I said, my brother's call has come, I have to attend to it. And my children always joke because they've hardly seen him, because he hardly come to Bangalore. What kind of brother whom we've not seen? But here we were in print describing each other as, as the brother we had never had. Now, he is, full of effervescence, full of wit, full of a kind of almost innocent joy. He's 75, but his zest for life is absolutely extraordinary. Again, different. Dharma Kumar, whom we talked about, did not write enough because he liked socializing in parties. Shekhar Pathak has not written as enough as he should have, because he's always trekking in remote parts of the Himalaya. I think he likes being in the field rather than actually sitting, though he's a great researcher and has written some good books. So I'd say what Shekhar did to me, apart beyond our intellectual friendship, was to make me feel less spurious in claiming that Uttarakhand was my home state. I am technically Tamil, but I was born and raised in Dehradun, which is now the capital of Uttarakhand. My doctoral research was on Uttarakhand. But I think it's the friendship with Shekhar and all that we've done together over these last many decades that have made me a kind of you could say, a less than completely inauthentic claimant to being a native Uttarakhand. So I'll just tell one last story. After Uttarakhand was formed, I was in Mussoorie giving a talk, and Mussoorie is one end of Uttarakhand, and he stays in Nainital and Kumaon, the other end. And I kind of called him from the call booth. This is the pre-cell phone days, 2000. And I called him from the call booth and I said, "मैं अपने प्रदेश से बोल रहा हूँ," which is kind of a sense of propriety. Yeah, I mean, I think. Again, Amit, to go back to what we talked about earlier. So, friendships across generations, friendships across professions, friendships also across social boundaries. I mean, in a sense, Shekhar and I come from such different backgrounds, and yet we've been able to sustain this very long, deep and loving friendship.
Something I've noticed about friendship is that as the years pass, you can take a friendship kind of for granted and it's kind of there. You don't think about it much. It has its place. You meet the person once in a while. Everything is beautiful. You carry on where you left off, but you never really think about it. And then you reach a certain stage where you think about this person for whatever reason. And you're like, like, oh my God, like this person means so much to me and I have never put it in words. And perhaps it is in the practice of putting it in words
Yes.
that you realize
Yes.
that the friendship is so incredibly deep. And did something like that happen with you and Shekhar?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think that we'll talk a little bit about maybe D.R. Nagaraj in a bit. But when D.R. Nagaraj died, I wrote an obituary, and it was long. It was published in the Hindu, and D.R. Nagaraj was a literary critic. And another literary critic who I'm not named, though he's still around and still publishes books of indifferent quality, was madly jealous that I had written this warm, full-blooded appreciation of D.R. Nagaraj. And he started telling people, Ram only writes about people when they're dead. Okay. Now, I knew why he was saying that because I would never write about him. But I took some of his criticism to heart. And thereupon, I started writing about people whom I admired, even while they were living. So my columns, it would not just be memorializing a person I admired who just passed on, but also people who were still around. Which I had previously only done for cricketers and not done that for writers or musicians or scholars. But now I would write about, musicians I admired or writers or activists who are still around and, so on. So I think it's true that when I worked on editing the English translation of Shekhar Pathak's magnificent history of the Chipko movement, and I decided to preface it with this long personal essay of how I got to know him and how I first met him in an archival file and how we became friends, acquaintances, then friends, and then brothers. You're right. That's when you realize how deep the friendship is.
There's a lovely passage I'm going to quote. Like you just said that you happened to find his address in Nainital and you went there and you said it so casually, but you've described that in more detail in your essay where you've written, quote, he now taught at the Kumaon University's Department of History in Nainital. I decided to drop in to see him unannounced. I took a train to Delhi and from there a bus to Nainital. I arrived at night and checked into a local inn. The next morning I asked for directions to Kumaon University, which I reached after an hour's stroll. I walked straight into the history department in the office of his best-loved teacher, Stop quote. And I read this and I thought, my God, that in these modern times, such a journey to meet someone is unconceivable, that you don't inform the person. You have no way of obviously being in touch with him and letting him know that I'm coming. And you make this massive journey, train to Delhi, bus to Nainital, you get there at night, the next day you ask for directions, you walk for an hour to kind of get there and all of that. Tell me a little bit about this attribute of yours, which how to me it feels like it's deeply uncommon, but maybe in
it's a manifestation. It may not be that uncommon, Amit, in people of my generation. It's a manifestation of the time. It's not, can I DM you? What's your WhatsApp number? All that is not there, right? So, and you want to meet this man, you don't want to, write a letter. I mean, it's okay. And, when you're young, I was in my early 20s, so taking a train and a bus is no big deal. And the only reason the walk took an hour is that I'm an asthmatic and I find it tough going up slopes.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody, Shekhar Pathak would have taken 10 minutes. Okay, so it was, and he was sitting there, and then he took me back home. And yeah, it's, it's like, I remember. Again, he means so much to me. But I'll just tell one last anecdote. Up the road from where we are is Koshi's Cafe.
I've been there often. I have bumped into you there.
Yeah, you know Koshi's. So Shekhar's daughter, lovely girl called Rupin, who called me Ram Kaka, so about 5-6 years ago, she said, Ram Kaka, I'm coming to Bangalore. I want you to meet a friend of mine. So we met at Koshi's. And she was, in fact, talking about, friendships across different boundaries. The boy is a Mangalore Catholic. And I could tell that she's romancing him and he's romancing her. And she wants to see what Ram Kaka will think of him. And I really liked him. It was lovely to see this young couple, charming young couple in love. And I called Shekhar. I said, मेरी अभी रूपन से मुलाकात थी और एक बहुत ही बढ़िया लड़का था उसके साथ. हाँ, उसके बहुत लड़के उसका दोस्त है. हाँ, कोई होगा. And she had not told him. But she wanted me to kind of the kindly uncle to approve. And then, of course, now they're married and they have a kid. So it's like, so just in a sense, there's also a charming family thing to it. Yeah.
A couple of more questions about him. And one of the things I was interested in digging into is that at one point he could have gone to JNU for his PhD, but he had a job in the Kumayo University and he decided to hang on and just take the job and work there and all that. And that seems like a very interesting choice because he is saying no to the credentialism that,
Yes.
being at JNU would have given him, which would have been significant for someone from his background. And he's choosing this local job. And at the same time, in the kind of work that he does, he's doing sort of atypical things. He's like throwing himself into the work, like you said, going out in the field, always traveling around. Even the book on Nansing Rawat, Asia Ke Peeth Par, is got sort of an unconventional choice. It's like
I'm hoping now. I'm working. I've got a. I won't put a nazar on it, but there's a young bilingual scholar in Bangalore. I mean, youngish, not that young, who is. I'm hoping will get that work into English. The work on the great explorer on Nansing Rawat.
Wow,
Shakers. That'd be fabulous. Yeah.
So tell me about this aspect of his, because ambition can manifest in people in different ways. If you're a scholar, I guess one way of ambition manifesting would be the thin desire of seeing your work acclaimed by others in the academy, getting the respect of others. And yet it seems that Shekhar wasn't really motivated by any of that.
He wasn't, but he's so comfortable in. He is again. I got to know him in the early 80s. So 83, 84. In 86, I went to teach at Yale for a year. And one of my American students wanted to do a summer project. So I gave him various names, and including Shakers. And he came back, wrote the project. And in the project, he said, my most valuable informant was Shekhar Pathak, the Encyclopedia of the Himalaya. Now, that is such a perfect description, but it hadn't struck me. But I say this because to answer your question, he is so comfortable in his ecological, cultural, historical, linguistic surroundings, and he soaks that so well, and he embodies and represents that so fully that he doesn't need acclaim from JNU or Oxford or anywhere else. I mean, he's a completely fulfilled person by in view of what he does and where he's from. I mean, he doesn't need any more.
And you spoke about not wanting to put a nazar, and you said that when in your book you mentioned that Shekhar Pathak is writing a history.
It took 30 years.
He took 30 years to write that. And at one point you quote from something that he wrote to Rukun Advani, who was his publisher then, and right at the end when the book came out, where Shekhar writes, "I am collecting material on Chipko from newspapers, books, articles, interviews from the real rural activists. There is a dominating lie in all the publications. You cannot find the real Chipko anywhere. One can feel that Chipko is a movement made by the media. I am doing my best to present the actual Chipko in its total historical perspective."
See what
Stop
he did,
quote.
yeah.
Which I'm guessing is exactly what he did. But how much of that is a problem? How much of the history that we know about our country and about all of these movements is actually a simplistic story told by the media?
Often. And Chipko particularly was so glamorized. Women hugging a tree, Gandhi, Himalaya, environmentalism, climate change. So there was many signifiers that lent it to this kind of glamorization and simplification.
So let's move on now to another man whom you often met in Koshi's Cafe, which is D.R. Nagraj. So tell me about him.
So D.R. Nagraj was like Shekhar Pathak in that what you would call an organic intellectual, not a westernized, deracinated man like myself. He came actually from a truly subaltern background. He was born in a weaving family in a town called Dodballapur, which is northwest of Bangalore, about 40 miles from here. And he made his reputation writing in Kannada. He was writing literary criticism in Kannada. And in 1993, he published a little book on Gandhi and Ambedkar called The Flaming Feet, which is a brilliant revolutionary book. It's, it went out of print. It's now come back, edited by his student, Prithvi Chandra Dattar Shobi. The Flaming Feet, I think you'll get it through Amazon quite easily. It's a brilliant revisionist account of how Gandhi and Ambedkar influenced one another. So the standard narrative is to portray them as implacable, unrelenting enemies who can never meet. And Nagraj shows two things. Firstly, he shows how they sat in their encounters and debates and exchanges, which were often quite polemical, over almost a 20-year period. they subtly influenced one another. Gandhi started taking more seriously the economic roots of social injustice. Uh, Ambedkar started taking more seriously the symbolic aspects of injustice and how actually changing conscience was equally important. That's one way it was revolutionary. The other way was to suggest that actually India needs both. India today, long after Ambedkar and Gandhi had gone, requires, self-aware, self-critical people of an upper caste background who recognize the injustices done to those at the bottom of the heap, and also requires a kind of Ambedkarite emphasis on self-renewal, self-emancipation, in Ambedkar's famous slogan, educate, organize, agitate. But actually, India needs both. Now, so this kind of simplistic polarizing of Gandhi and Ambedkar actually started during the national movement. So when Gandhians disparaged and demonized Ambedkar for siding with the British, for being in the Viceroy's Executive Council when the Quit India movement is on, and has now been carried on much later by the Ambedkarites, who see Gandhi as condescending, patronizing, and of course, they always quote him out of context to say he supported the caste system blindly, which is not true, and so on. So Nagaraj's book is sort of polemical work, but it's a very subtle sociological debunking of these kind of standard polarization of Gandhi and Ambedkar. Now, so that's how I read him and first met him. And I moved to Bangalore in 1995. So, as I said, I grew up in Dehradun and educated in Delhi and Calcutta. And after Sujata and I got married and we had 2 kids in Delhi, she is from Bangalore and my ancestors were from Bangalore. So we moved here. And one of the real attractions of moving here was to deepen my friendship with Nagaraj. I'd got to know him a bit in Delhi, but then we'd meet at Koshi's and we'd debate and argue. And then tragically he died. And I was with him at Koshi's the day before he died. So we were chatting from about 4 to 6. And then he said, I have to go for dinner. And it's at the home of there was a sociologist called Professor S. Jaffet who taught at the National Law School. He said, I have to go to Jaffet's house for dinner. And I would have asked you to come. But except that the conversation will mostly be in Kannada and you don't drink. So he smiled and he went off. And early the next morning, I got a call from a young sociologist who teaches in Bangalore still, called Chandan Gowda. And as soon as the phone rang, I knew it was bad news. Because Nagaraj was a diabetic who liked his whiskey and liked his cigarettes and liked good food. And I kind of knew it is bad news about Nagaraj. And so it was. And maybe I'll tell some stories. I mean, rather than talk about his work, I can talk a little bit about his work, but I'll tell some stories about him too, which might interest you. So, the week before he died, I met Girish Karnad for the first time. And the great Girish Karnad. And he invited Sujata and me for lunch. And as soon as we entered the house, he said, we've not met, but I read your articles in EPW, and you can be quite polemical. So I said, so can you. And my wife, Sujata, who grew up revering Karnad as an actor, as did many of us, who was, wondering why her husband is getting into a fight. So Girish sat me down and said, what do you mean? I said, you wrote this vicious review of T.G. Vaidyanathan's book on film. And T.G. Vaidyanathan is it was his first book. You're an established scholar, and why did you demolish it? At which point Girish said, maybe now I think you're right, because D.R. Nagaraj was here the last week and he told me the same thing. Why were you, a celebrated intellectual actor, so mean to a college lecturer who's written his first book? Anyway, so then Nagaraj died, and I took T.G. Vaidyanathan to condole with the widow. And later on, there was a memorial meeting. And that memorial meeting, Amit, was he was 44 when he died. That memorial meeting was in the Senate House of Bangalore University. And literally, there were people from the rafters. And Girish Karnad and T.G. Vaidyanathan, who hated one another, were brought together by their admiration for Nagaraj and were sitting in the front row. It was that kind of meeting. And, I miss him still because he was the most brilliant, original thinker of my generation. I have no doubt about that. I mean, the conversations we had, which I describe in my essay, and there have been 2 posthumous volumes of his published in English, both by his student Prithvi. There's a third book coming out, translated from Kannada into English, which is a landmark book he wrote on a medieval Kannada poet called Allama Prabhu. So some of his work is still around, but I have never been as devastated by the death of an intellectual as I have by the passing of Nagaraj, because he was my generation, and I was 40, he was 44, and I looked forward to decades of friendship and debate and argument and, exchanges and so on. He was a truly brilliant man.
You mentioned T.G. Vaidyanathan, and in your 98 essay on him, I think was titled "The Rooted Cosmopolitan," and that's a phrase I actually first learned from Sugata Srinivasa Raju in my episode with him. And for some reason, I thought Sugata came up with the phrase, but then I just read your essay on Nagaraj.
I think it's not my original; it's an old phrase.
It's an old phrase, there's a beautiful illustration of this which includes T.G. Vaidyanathan. In fact, after I moved to Bangalore in 1995, Nagaraj and I would meet occasionally and always in Koshi's Parade Cafe. Living in the largely English and Tamil-speaking Bangalore cantonment, I could never hope to enter his world, the Kannada-speaking city. He, of course, moved with ease from one cultural universe to the other. His roots were so deep that he never sought to parade them or to casually dismiss cosmopolitanism. The dedication of his first book to T.G. Vaidyanathan was an illustration of this. Nagaraj told me that the gesture was resented by some who asked how he could honor a man who did not speak Kannada. Nagaraj's answer was that TGV had lit up his mind, as he had lit up the minds of other Bangalore boys who came to listen to him in English but spoke Kannada or Malayalam or Gujarati at home. Stop quote. And such a lovely story. Here's a question. The Flaming Feet, brilliant as it were, did not arise sui generis out of somewhere. It speaks to a mind which is constantly thinking in different ways about the world, rejecting received wisdom, questioning everything. Tell me a bit more about that mind.
I didn't know him well enough, but I think the books that have come out of him since, which describe his intellectual genealogy. But, there are some things. So, he comes from... So, Shekhar Pathak grows up in Almora and Nainital, which are the centers of what passes for Kumaoni cultural life. Other writers, are like the famous Bengali writers, Mahashweta Devi, are from Kolkata. Mahadevi Verma is from Allahabad. Nagaraj comes from a really small town and is born really in a backward caste. And from there he comes to Bangalore and grows. And one of his early mentors was U.R. Ananthamurthy, and who recognized his precocious brilliance and took him under his wing. And at one stage, Ananthamurthy told Nagaraj, I have nothing more to teach you. Go to Delhi and learn from Ashish Nandi. Now, I think of, let's say, uncommonly generous gesture from Ananthamurthy. Normally Indian gurus think, I have to keep my chela close to me. I can't share him with someone else. But here is Ananthamurthy recognizing that this man is so brilliant that he has come from Dodbalapur to Bangalore. Now he has to go from Bangalore to Delhi. So he spent several years at the CSDS in Delhi. He's at the Shimla Institute of Advanced Studies. And that writes The Flaming Feet. And then he meets the celebrated American Sanskritist Sheldon Pollock. And Sheldon Pollock is then actually learning Kannada, old Kannada. So Nagaraj educates him. And then Pollock takes him to Chicago, where he tries to persuade him to accept the chair vacated by the death of A.K. Ramanujan.
Wow.
Again, one must underline the cultural and social distance between A.K. Ramanujan and D.R. Nagaraj. I mean, brilliant as he was, Ramanujan, like me and people of upper caste background, English-speaking upper, started with enormous advantages. Ramanujan was an Iyengar, the pinnacle of Brahmanism in South India. Ramanujan's father was a professor of mathematics. He spoke, and he famously said, I spoke English with my father in his study, Tamil with my mother in the kitchen, and Kannada in the streets. Now, and of course, does a PhD in Indiana at a great school of folklore, and then teaches at Chicago, and dies tragically young. Now, Nagaraj, a weaver's son from Dodballapur, educated in Bangalore University, has made such a mark through his writings by the time he's in his 40s that Sheldon Pollock thinks I have to post this guy to replace A.K. Ramanujan at Chicago. Now that's when we became friends. And he's wondering, should I go? Can I leave? Like Shekhar Pathak is so rooted in Uttarakhand. Can I leave my Kannada cultural world, political world, my friends, my contacts, the source of my life? And then he tells Sherry Pollock, I can't come. But I'll come one term a year. Summer term, April to June is, and so he would have been the kind of work he could have done. He was telling me he wanted to write a book on the Nation of Islam. He had actually met Louis Farrakhan in Chicago.
Wow.
So, his intellectual ambitions were immense. So it is, as I said, it's a colossal loss to our intellectual life. And I knew him very little. We had an intense friendship, not very little. Did not know him long enough. I knew him for a very short period. We had an intense friendship, I'd say in the last 6 or 9 months of his life. That's it. There are people who knew him much longer, much better. But even those 6 months were enough to tell me that this is an intellectual of an altogether different order from anyone else I know.
By sheer dint of his background alone, would it be fair to say that the phrase we discussed earlier, partial outsider,
Yes,
would
sir.
apply to him?
Very much so, yeah.
Because then, that would account for his intellectual independence, not being bound to the dogmas or fashions of the time. And
Absolutely.
tell me also about what can modern Ambedkarites, or for that matter, modern thinkers, learn from D.R. Nagraj?
Whenever I speak to Americans, I tell them read Flaming Feet. Just learn from, and of course, I'd say this, that I'm actually writing something now, exploring this paradox. Nagraj had some very close friends in the Kannada world. He was not a Dalit himself. He was from the Viva caste, which is just above, untouchable status. But he had 2 very close Dalit friends. One was the poet Siddhalingaya, whose memoir has been translated in English. It's a beautiful work, who died some years ago. The other is a brilliant Kannada novelist and public intellectual called Devanur Mahadeva, who's still alive and who lives in Mysore and recently wrote a brilliant tract on the RSS, which I had the privilege of introducing in English. So Nagraj, I think, what is interesting about Mahadeva, Siddhalingaya and Nagraj is that none of them demonized Gandhi. They admired admired Ambedkar without demonizing Gandhi. And that made them very different from Dalit Bahujan intellectuals in Maharashtra and Uttar Pradesh and other places. So I think Nagraj was also shaped by Mahadeva and Siddhalingaya quite a lot. I think he was able to verbalize, articulate some of the ideas and innovate in English, because he also was able to write quite well in English. But The Flaming Feet is the indispensable book. I would recommend it to everyone who's interested in either Gandhi or Ambedkar.
Apart from what The Flaming Feet did to you, what else did he make you rethink? Like, was there something he said in casual conversation one day which really...
A few things. One of the things he told me, which again I've been writing about, I wrote about much later. We used to have all kinds. We were talking about autobiographies. And I said, the British have a wonderful self-deprecatory humor. So you read their memoirs and, you get a sense of how funny and witty they are, including making fun of themselves. And I was telling Nagraj that, Gandhi, if you look at the great Indian autobiographies, Gandhi, Nehru, Niraj Chaudhary, all great books, but there's not a single joke. They're so fucking solemn and pitchy. And Nagraj said, that's not true of the Kannada autobiographies, and including Siddhalingaya's. And then Siddhalingaya's book was translated much later in English, and long after Nagraj died, I read it. So he was very alert to, nuance and differences in genres across different linguistic traditions. So as I said, we must have had half a dozen conversations in these 6 months. That's it. Because, we maybe met once a month and we chatted and debated. And... he's going, and some of his students were devastated. 1 or 2 of his students still haven't recovered from his going. He was such an extraordinary figure. He was gone almost 27 years, yeah.
Let's go on to Anjan Ghosh, a big influence on you. Tell me about him. Tell me about when you first met him. What were your impressions?
So when I talk about Anjan Ghosh, who was my first and in many ways best teacher, I'll have to begin with some autobiography. So I think we may have chatted about this in earlier conversations, but I'll have to go over some of the same ground to get to Anjan Ghosh. So I studied economics in St. Stephen's. I was not very good at it. I was playing cricket and my cricket career peaked. And in my MA, I read the works of Verrier Elwin. And I took a year off, came to Bangalore, lived with my grandparents, and appeared for the IAS and failed. And read sociology and decided to become a sociologist. And because my grades in my MA were bad, the only place that gave me admission was the IIM in Calcutta. And this part I may not have spoken about before, but I think it's worth speaking about. One of the reasons I applied to the IIM in Calcutta was that Shiv Vishwanathan, who teaches sociology in Delhi University, told me that my classmate Anjan Ghosh has joined the IIM department and he's very good. So I got into the IIM and I was wondering whether to take a mainstream job or risk a PhD given my indifferent academic record. And I had a mentor whom we've not talked about here, but who was actually as important as any of the others, who was a retired civil servant called C.S. Venkatachar, who was actually 60 years older than me and who lived close to my grandfather's house and who was a friend of M.N. Srinivas, the greatest ever Indian sociologist. He said, if you're facing a dilemma as to whether to study sociology, I'll take you to meet M.N. Srinivas. So we walked down the road to M.N. Srinivas's house and Srinivas told me, IIM Calcutta has a third-rate sociology department. It's better not to study sociology than to study it there. But for a variety of reasons, maybe because of my stubborn independence, I rejected his advice. Went to Calcutta, where I found that M.N. Srinivas was not entirely inaccurate because there were three senior members of the department who were truly second-rate. Anjan was the junior most, but he was absolutely brilliant. Now, Anjan, the story of Anjan is actually how Anjan got to Calcutta is also a story I should tell briefly. So Anjan was the most brilliant sociologist of his generation. He studied at JNU. He was a topper. And Delhi, we've talked about the vibrancy of Delhi universities in Delhi at that stage. And Delhi was the center of Indian sociology. JNU and Delhi had the best departments. And Anjan had to leave his job in Delhi because his father died and he was the only son and he had to look after his mother. And the only job he got there was at IIM Calcutta. So here was Anjan, bereft of a sociological community. And here am I, a young, confused, but keen sociology student coming from Bangalore, and we were just made for each other. So, he took me through the sociological classics, Marx, Weber, Durkheim. He introduced me to the finest works of anthropology. He encouraged me to think beyond my discipline. So E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, literary theory. He made me a member of the film club. And you're from Bengal. So the wonderful film clubs that are truly all class. They are clerks and they are babus and they are office superintendents, all watching Truffaut and Godard and Ray and Kurosawa. So he just shaped me as a thinker, a scholar. And I owe everything to him. My next book, which is a book of arguments with Gandhi, it's called Arguments with Gandhi, is actually dedicated to him. Because I had my first arguments with Gandhi also about him. And without him, I would have not written a single book.
Why do you say that?
Because he gave me the confidence to be a scholar. He gave me single-handed that a training a big university department would have given its students. And luckily, the IIM had a good library. And the social science library, the sociology, history, politics books were exclusively for me because the management students only wanted to read the stuff on, finance and marketing and operations research. So if I have one mentor and one guru, it was Anjan Ghosh. And there are many, many other things he taught me. One of the things he taught me, which is again something young writers and scholars should bear in mind. He said, you should always distinguish between the scholar and the human being. There may be a wonderful, noble, kindly, saintly scholar who's a wonderful, noble and kindly as a human being, but whose scholarship is indifferent and mediocre. And on the other hand, there may be a human being who's a perfect asshole and selfish and cruel and arrogant, but his scholarship is brilliant. So if what happens often with young people is that they meet a writer and they say, sir, and then the writer is standoffish. And they turn off that writer or that scholar but actually the work may be brilliant. I mean, Naipaul is the best example of a perfect arsehole who was a great writer. But Anjan taught me this lesson, which I think has always stood me in good stead. Never confuse the scholar and the human being, I mean, he was also, he was a Marxist, but he did not preach Marxism in the classroom. He taught me all other forms of social theory. And he just expanded my mind. I mean, he just introduced me to so many things and gave me the confidence that I could be a scholar. So I'd say always that he was absolutely my mentor. And he died young of cancer, so, he's no longer here. And he never fulfilled his own writing potential.
It appears actually from the list of heroes of 5 we have discussed in this episode and a bunch of others. I think you sent me a list of 13 heroes of yours. That in all of them, actually, they are good people as well as great scholars. So the conflict doesn't happen there. But
I've just been lucky, I think. But as well, others, when they're people I still read even though I don't like them because I learn from what they say. Yeah.
In your essay on Anjan, you write at one point, quote, "Among the gifts Anjan bestowed on me was an introduction to the charmed circle of intellectuals that hung around the journal Frontier, then edited by the lapsed poet and lapsed Marxist Samar Sen. From the IIM campus in Joka, I made a weekly journey to the Frontier office in central Kolkata, where Samar Babu and his devoted assistant Timir Basu discussed the contents of the forthcoming issue and allocated tasks to each of us. Intellectuals are a selfish, solitary species. This, on the other hand, was an exercise in collective, collaborative work that enriched all those who participated in it." Quote. Elaborate a bit on this. What were those meetings like, and what difference did it make to your life?
Because it's a long time ago. I mean, it's like, gosh, it's 45 years ago. So it's again, talking about meetings, going to see Shekhar Pathak by train and bus. So the IIM campus is in the extreme south of Calcutta, well beyond Alipur, in a place called Joka. So you take one bus to Thakurpukur, then another bus to Alipur, then you take the tram to Chaurangi, and then you walk into somewhere near Metro Cinema as the Frontier office. So, and for a young person, the excitement of entering a den of radical intellectuals, well-known radical intellectuals, the thrill, it's a different kind of thrill, you at a time when you can't get your thrills through your phone or the television. Yeah, so, and Samarkand was a wonderful, he was a great poet who gave up writing poetry. In fact, even Tagore admired his poetry. He was a revolutionary poet. Then he was kind of, as I said, a lapsed Marxist. And we used to bring out this weekly on yellowing newsprint. As someone said of the Nation magazine, the Xerox looked better than the original. And Frontier was a bit like that. Yeah, it was kind of the romance of youth and idealism and discovering the vocation of being an intellectual.
And I was also struck by something you wrote about Anjan, where you said he wrote an elegant thesis, sadly never published in book form, on the social role of rumor in intensifying communal violence in 20th century Bengal. And when I read that, I thought, my God, what a fantastic subject for the modern time. Because, the
social media and all that comes, absolutely.
Fully amplified and exacerbated.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm going to look for the thesis after this is over because I badly want to read it. Tell me also about the PODR, which he played such a key role in. Because on the one hand, you talk about how he kept his politics out of his classroom. He had his film society, etc., etc. But apart from all of that, he was also a deeply dedicated social worker, so civil libertarian.
Yeah, so the civil liberties movement started during and after the emergency, and there were 3 or 4 groups. There was the PODR in Delhi, which Anjan was more or less a founder member, and after he moved to Calcutta, the Calcutta group was called APDR, Association of Protection of Democratic Reforms, and these groups were run by public-spirited, idealistic professionals. So the APDR in Kolkata was founded by a retired government engineer called Kapil Bhattacharya. The PUCL in Delhi was founded by the jurist V.M. Tarkunde. The PODR was run by C.V. Subbarao, who was another close friend of mine and a hero of mine, who was a teacher, taught economics at Delhi University, and a lawyer called Govinda Mukhoti, incidentally the father of the writer Ira Mukhoti, as it turns. And, they started by documenting aberrations of human rights in the emergency, but carried on when Janata Party was in power and all through the 80s. And sadly now they are kind of defunct. I mean, either the people who ran them have become too old and too tired, or they've met retribution and vindictiveness by the government, because the government, this government doesn't like any kind of independent scrutiny. But, if it was a communal riot, they would go and investigate it and write a report, a so-called fact-finding report. One of the best reports written by PUDR was on the anti-Sikh riots of 1984, called Who Are the Guilty? If there was, violations of labor laws in a coal mine, they would write about that. If there was a new law that impinged harshly on Adivasis, if under trials were being treated badly in the Alipur jail, there would be a report on the inhuman conditions in which these, and the kind of things that the regular media would not report. So this is all voluntary kind of associations. So a college lecturer would give 50 rupees a month to the PUDR or the APDR. There was also one in run by Asghar Ali Engineer, the Islamic reformer in Bombay. I think that was not called, that was called CPDR, Committee for the Protection of Democratic Rights. So in Andhra, you had the APCLC, which associated with the mathematician and lawyer K. Balgopal, and Kannabiran, the also well-known lawyer. So there were these, I read again, talking about books that need to be written. A history of the civil rights movement in India from the 70s till its decline in the 2000s, I think, again, would be a fabulous fact. And they're completely self-effacing. So these reports had no names. 5 people did the investigation, wrote the report, paid for the printing out of their own funds, their own modest salaries, and then distributed it. And held a press conference, got some reports in the press, tried to get it translated into Hindi or Bangla or Marathi or whatever. And it was just a record of the aberrations and excesses of the Indian state. Invaluable record, I'd say.
What did Anjan dream for himself? Like you said, you would not have written any books if not for him. He shaped so many young people.
I think Anjan was actually a wonderful teacher. He had to leave the university in Delhi because his father died and he had to be with his mother. And he found himself in a management institute which was not really congenial to a serious scholar of sociology. Then he joined a research institute in Calcutta, which is all research and very little teaching. I think he loved nurturing, mentoring young minds. And again, when I talked about what was distinctive about the intellectual culture of Kolkata, Anjan exemplified the bilingual nature. So he wrote in English and in Bangla. That's something, and stuff of quality. It's not, that he was dumbing down while writing in Bangla, because Bangla, I talk about little magazines. There were 2 or 3 magazines which I don't read, but I don't read Bangla, but I knew about their reputation. One was called Anushtup, one was called Baromas, and there was a third called Ekhon. These 3 magazines actually would carry high quality sociological, literary, political, economic essays, of the quality that EPW would carry. So Anjan was, I think he traversed the world between scholarship and civil liberties work, between writing in English, between writing in Bangla. But he was at heart a teacher, and I was lucky to be the student who benefited the most from him, because I was so closely interacting with him all through the 4 years of my PhD.
And did you stay in touch with him after that?
Yes.
So,
and then after he died, of course, and this book, I said, my next book is dedicated to him, because I was exceptionally fortunate in being mentored by him.
Ram, in the list of 13 people, and perhaps you'll do a future episode on more of them. In the list of 13 people that you sent, 12 are no more, right? And most of them you knew personally. A couple you didn't.
Andre Bete is still around.
Yeah, he's still
infirm.
around. Yeah,
in his 90s. Yeah.
So, how does that kind of feel when your friends leave you one by one? As you age, your friends leave you one by one, and you have so many rich memories. One day you're sitting in Koshis with DR Nagaraj, and the next morning you get the phone call. You're living beneath Dharma Kumar's flat, and then one day she is no more, and they kind of pass on. How does it change you? Like, one way in which I think that it might change you, and you can elaborate on if that is so, is that it leads you to reflect on them more and understand the nature of the relationship you had with them and the influence they had on you. But apart from that, how does it change the way that you live and the way that you look at life?
I feel blessed and grateful that I knew these people. And I learned so much from them. And we had a relationship of love, affection, regard, mutual respect. And they left me with so much. I mean, I was just, again, we started by talking about coincidence, that I was lucky to meet a whole range of most remarkable, unusual people. Obviously, in person. So in my work, I mean, there's a thrill writing about Vedya Railway, no, Palwankar Balu, or Gandhi and Ambedkar, but to know people of this kind, and the others too. I mean, they are like, I sent you a list of Indians, but there's, there's a Catalan scholar who's one my closest foreign friend, the British historian David Gilmour, the late Jim Scott, the great Yale anthropologist. So I think E.P. Thompson. So I think I'm just very, very fortunate in the course of my zigzag journey through life and through scholarship to meet all these kinds of unusual, interesting people. And so I feel grateful and blessed. I mean, I'd say Nagaraj was tragic because he was 44 and he had so much to give. And I said, not just me, anyone who knew him misses him still because he had so much to give and he was so truly brilliant. And to be snatched away at that age, though his students have produced these 3 wonderful books of his to perpetuate his intellectual legacy, it's not like having him around because he's also a sparkling conversationalist, a speaker. I mean, I remember, I told you about this memorial meeting at Central College where people are hanging from the rafters. As I came out, one of the people who was there was the celebrated Kannada filmmaker Girish Kasaravalli. And he was just coming out. And of course, he knew Nagaraj much longer than me, because he had lived in Bangalore, the same cultural universe. And he said, I heard Nagaraj speak so many times in English and in Hindi and in Kannada. He said, every speech of his educated me. It was different. He was not repeating stories or analogues or similes. It was crafted for the particular occasion, a film society opening, a literary conference, a meeting on Ambedkar, a protest about communal rioting. And he said, he just said it spontaneously. We were just coming out, walking out. And he said that I heard him so many times in English and in Kannada. And every speech of his was different and differently illuminating, So he was not just a writer, he was also a communicator, a public intellectual in Kannada and in English. And his mother tongue, incidentally, was Telugu. So he may have been most fluent of all in Telugu. So I think that is, so he is someone who, and again, there may be some Kannada listeners who are, will listen to this podcast. I actually knew him quite superficially. I said I knew him for the last 6-8 months of his life. And we had about half a dozen very intense meetings. But there were people who knew him much better and who would, obviously some ways miss him all the more. But I said to larger issue, to having known these people, to having worked with them, learned from them, been befriended by them, is a special blessing.
I'll read all of his work that I can find, but thank you for introducing him to all of us. And my final question for you, what interesting books have you read recently? What music have you been listening to? What films have you been watching?
So, I told you this Roy Motade's The Mantle and the Prophets, which I'm now reading, which I would strongly recommend. Music-wise, I'll say a little bit of music. I've been listening a lot to the great Agra Gharana Ustads. So, Sharafat Hussain Khan, Latafat Hussain Khan, Ratan Dinkar Kekani. Someone who's not Agra Gharana, but I really love is Malini Rajorkar, who's Gwalior Gharana. All people who are dead. But also, so I said, I've been listening, and then on one side, and that is on the vocal side. On the instrumental side, these 2 magnificent Sarodiyas from Calcutta of the Senia Gharana, Radhika Mohan Moitro and Buddhadev Dasgupta, also both long dead. So I think that, but also I'd say that incidentally, there are two new good recent books on the history of Hindustani classical music, which I can mention.
Please.
One is by very different, but both for lovers of music, well worth buying and reading. One is by Priya Purushothaman. It's called The Call of Music. Now, Priya Purushothaman is a very accomplished, youngish Agra Gharana vocalist, whom I like very much. I've been listening to her for many years. She's a wonderful singer, so her recordings are also up on YouTube. But she's written this book, Amit, which is a work of rare generosity, artistic generosity. It's about 8 fellow musicians of a generation. Now, you're not going to find a celebrated writer writing in praise of 8 other writers. It's rare, You may write about someone dead. Like if you ask Naipaul, who are the writers you admire, he'd say Proust, Dickens, Aristotle, Socrates. Okay. Now, so she's written about these 8 different musicians and their different paths into music. So one is from, one is actually Ali Akbar Khan's youngest son. Another is another is a sarangi player from a low-caste Muslim family. Then there are some Maharashtrian housewives who had to fight against their husband and their mother-in-law to become musicians. Then there's a Bengali called Bhaumik who is an IIT IIM graduate who then discovered music and so she's written this book hence the call of music. So music as a vocation. And these 8 profiles, very sensitive profiles, which she's interviewed people. One, Kala Ramnath, the well-known violinist, is also one. How she broke away from her family tradition of Carnatic music into Hindustani music. So that's one book. The other book is by Sumana Ramanan and it's called The Secret Master. And it's about one musician, Arun Kashalkar, the elder brother of the much better known Ulas Kashalkar, and his commitment to music and his scholarship and his rigor and his reticence and reclusiveness. Why hasn't hence the secret master? Why hasn't such a accomplished musician become better known? And so Sumana, Priya is a singer herself. Sumana is a very keen and knowledgeable listener who decided to learn from Arun Kashalkar and then write this book. And it's also a kind of through Arun Kashalkar, it's a history of the development of Khayal and the different gharanas, Gwalior and Rampur and Jaipur and Agra and the different variations. So I've enjoyed reading these 2 books about music also while listening to me.
Ram, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today. I really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
A pleasure.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. Please buy all of Ram's book from your nearest bookstore, online or offline. But if you are in Bangalore, you can go to Bookworm or to Blossoms, one of those bookshops that he truly, truly loves. You can follow Ram on Twitter, or X as it is now called, at Ram_Guha. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AMITBARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and every podcast app of your choice. Isn't that amazing? Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.